Your parents were too busy. Your education let you down. People told you culture wasn't for you. But you're not stupid, and this stuff's really interesting. Join us for some drinking and thinking about the best of 5,000 years of human civilization. After all, it belongs to you. Oh, hello.
Cheers.
I'm now doing the other important technical thing, which is pouring myself a glass of red wine, which presumably you're not going to join me on this because you're driving.
Well, actually, I am having a glass of Bucks Fizz, quite a strong fizz than Bucks.
I should say I'm drinking a lovely bottle, which is doubly suitable because it's the grape variety is Black Trojan. It's an ancient grape variety that they say was planted by Trojans coming to Italy. So I thought, this is exactly the one to deploy. So cheers.
Cheers.
We started media res, as all good things start, and that is exactly what went wrong with The Phantom Menace. There was a reason why Star Wars Episode 4 was a brilliant way to get into Star Wars. It's because you're right there into the action, and you can work out, through flashbacks and description what happened before, but you're right in the most exciting stuff right from the beginning. You don't have to start with the fucking, there was a trade dispute on Naboo and various political ramifications. No, just go straight to the action. And
there was a reason why originally they didn't have the word Episode 4 appear under the Star Wars thing, because there are some people, and I count my mother in this, who simply cannot deal with any sort of narrative complexity. That they'll be like, I don't know what's going on, like nothing's being explained, why isn't this happening exactly? Like, and the sort of people would endlessly ask questions. You go, no, it's fine. You don't need to know that at that point. The author has considered you and is going to provide you all the information you need to make sense. They are aware of what is happening. You haven't missed something. But in media res, which you're quite right, is absolutely the best way to do this. And essentially all three of our things today take that approach. For some people, very, very difficult. It's fine. You're not stupid. The author is just trying something narratively complex and not very complex. So don't worry.
Wrath. Sing, goddess, of the wrath of Achilles, son of Peleus, that baneful wrath which brought countless woes upon the Achaeans, and sent forth to Hades many valiant souls of warriors, and made their bodies carrion for dogs and all manner of birds. And thus the will of Zeus was being brought to fulfilment. Sing of it from the time when at the first there parted in strife Atreus' son, the king of men, and godlike Achilles.
This is the earliest work in Western literature, shall we say. We're talking about Homer and his great epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So we're going back to, we're not quite sure exactly when they were composed, but probably around 700, 750 BC, which, by the way, was about the time the Olympic Games started. So we're talking at the very beginnings of Western civilization in ancient Greece.
We're about 1,000 years, 800 years after our episode 1 last time, Epic of Gilgamesh.
And not much has happened that's exactly right, and not much has happened except a massive dark age. And this is important because basically, to be incredibly oversimplistic, you've got your early Bronze Age civilizations trundling along, the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Babylonians, the Hittites, and the Mycenaean Greeks. And then there is a massive dark age. It's called the Bronze Age collapse. Every one of the early cities across Greece, Turkey, the Middle East is destroyed within a kind of 20 or 30 year window. We know that from the archaeology. Ancient Egypt isn't entirely destroyed, but goes into what they call an intermediate period where they're just clinging on, shall we say. Same in Babylon. And we don't really know what caused this, but there was clearly an enormous amount of bloodshed and destruction.
A shout out at this point. I mean, there's a In Our Time radio series, which also does a podcast, not as good as this one, but very good nonetheless. Actually has an episode on the Bronze Age collapse. It's well worth a listen to. We know something happened. We know there's an interruption in the human civilization story. A massive step back.
And it's really interesting that as people started to come out of that, people thought about it in those terms. So don't listen to your typical ludicrous academic from the University of shit that says, oh, actually, it's just a different way of living. People decided they didn't like living in the cities anymore with tools and, writing and stuff like that, and they just go back to the land, and but actually they were living harmoniously with nature. No, it was an absolute fucking catastrophe. And everyone knew that. And Homer knew it, because Homer, who was the greatest poet of ancient Greece, he talks about, as I think does Hesiod, the idea that basically mankind is on a downward trajectory, starting with an age of gold, an age of gods, and then an age of silver, an age of bronze. And they knew there had been a Bronze Age where people didn't have iron, so the weapons in the battles that we're going to describe are all bronze weapons.
Yes, in fact, actually, I mean, jumping ahead, but it's quite fascinating that when Homer recounts these stories of armies and military forces reigned, he actually is quite clear that he describes the sort of geography and the sort of sending nations which will participate in this huge campaign as they were at the time that the poem set, and not when he's writing. So, as you say, he really is writing about these events and this turning point in human history, rather than just slapdashly go, oh, well, there's some heroes and they're having an adventure. Whilst it speaks to the present day that he's writing in, and indeed I would make an argument, I'm sure you'd agree, to all days, he really is, setting it in this mysterious, crucial point in history.
Absolutely, and isn't that fascinating? And there are other echoes as well. So the nature of the fighting, he talks about chariot fighting, things that the Greeks were not doing at the time that Homer was composing this, but he has vague memories of this previous civilization, and they talk about heroes, being able to do things that people in Homer's day couldn't do. So there's very much a sense of this is the end of an amazing period of civilization, and we know that that's true. And Homer is at the point where civilization is just beginning, the heartbeat is beginning to come back, and it's still lost in the kind of the very end of this dark age, so we don't really know much about Homer, hardly anything about him. We don't even know if he wrote these or whether he merely composed them orally and then they were written down. There's even a theory that ancient Greek writing was invented in order to write this down because it was such a fucking good poem. Anyway,
there's lots of theories there going whether Homer was historical, whether he's a collection of people. I mean, we could spend hours and hours and hours just discussing that issue. This concept of progress that we have very much since the Enlightenment, that humanity is on this ever upward trend, that each year or each century that passes, that humanity gets better, it becomes more developed, more scientifically advanced, more knowledgeable. It really is one of our myths that we have as our current civilization. Actually, nearly all civilizations prior to the Enlightenment, or perhaps the Renaissance, thought of things in the other way around, thought things had been better before, and that humanity was on this downward spiral, and that they would look back and go, well, of course things were better back then. We look back at these gods and we're only half the people that they were. We find that very difficult, I think, nowadays to understand that was their worldview, because it's so utterly opposed to our own worldview.
Yeah, and they're still Nigel Farage, basically. We just have this sense of progress because there has been progress over the last few centuries, but that's actually a very short period in human civilization. That is very much something that comes through in Homer. They're talking about a period of history that they vaguely remember and that they know was more advanced than their own time, and it's populated with heroes leading vast forces from, as you say, cities and nations that in his time didn't really exist anymore. So, okay, it's garbled, but it is. I think that adds an extra pathos. But it's worth remembering as we go through all this, Homer's not talking about his own time. He's talking about something that was already hundreds of years in the past. Because the works of Homer and later Virgil, the great Roman poet that we're going to come on to later in the podcast, talking about the Trojan War and its aftermath, are the foundation of Western literature, a huge foundation stone of Western culture. These stories have been passed on. People have done different things with them. Bits of them will be familiar to everyone. Most people will have heard of, the Trojan War, the wooden horse. People will have heard of Ulysses, perhaps, and his adventures. The Cyclops, the myths of the foundation of Rome. But they might well not have encountered these original poems themselves. They might have found, they might have come across, a book of Greek myths or something when they were young, something like that. A lot of this stuff gets a lot of its power from the fact that it's familiar, but people may well not have encountered the original sources, and they will be blown away when they realise how good they are. Basically, this is my pitch.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we've got a problem here, because we're talking about three epic poems, all of which are absolutely epic in length, in scope, in depth.
In what they say to the human condition.
In what they say to the human condition. They are foundational stones for our civilization and for all subsequent Western literature. And unfortunately, this is going to have to be a bit of an epic podcast, because we're talking about three of the absolute big boys here. So we've got two works by Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad being the story of the siege of Troy, and the Odyssey being the story of the hero's return from Troy to Greece, the Greek hero's return, and then written down about 700 years later, we've got Virgil's the Aeneid, which is the story of the Trojans who escaped from Troy and their founding of Rome. So the sort of foundation myths of Rome
is an attempt to provide a Latin version of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's already an epic work, a foundational work in literature to Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, who wrote that, and it's very consciously an homage and the other side of the story. He is deliberately aping level of epicness. So, it's already that Virgil itself, which is an ancient text to us, looks back to the Iliad and the Odyssey as its inspiration.
Yeah, absolutely right, and basically trying to show that the Romans are just as important as the Greeks and just as heroic. Okay, there's a lot of stuff to deal with here, but as you say, all of this background adds to your appreciation, but you don't need to know it. You can open the Iliad, which is the first of these books, page 1, line 1, and as you start to describe it, it starts in media res. It doesn't start with a big long description of who everyone is and where they come from. It just goes straight in. Rage. That's the first word, right? Rage. This is about rage. It's about the rage of individuals who are recognisable, albeit on a heroic scale, recognisable human characters who you grow to love and hate and want to root for, and how they are caught up in this huge war. As you read into it, you'll find out everything you need to know. So you don't need to be put off by the fact that you might not be familiar with this. Just go straight in. Because that's exactly what Homer does. He starts off by saying, I'm going to tell you about the rage of Achilles, who is the strongest of the Greek heroes, and why he's angry, basically, and what happened as a result of it. The Greeks have been besieging Troy for 10 years. So it doesn't start at the beginning of the war, he starts at the beginning of the end of the war. So they've already been fighting for 10 years, and you will find out through flashbacks how that war started, why it started, what happened during the first 10 years of it, and what's about to happen.
Of course, the original heroes of that may well have known these stories already, that Homer perhaps was not the originator of these myths, but the collector of them in their final form. That's a big discussion to have as to what extent he's an author or a collector. But the point is, and I think you've already made it, it doesn't matter, because it's so well constructed that whilst it might have been that the very first listeners or readers of the Iliad were like, oh yeah, okay, wow, you're starting us at the end because we all know how they've got there.
Right.
Actually, it works perfectly well if you don't know anything about how they've got there, because he's that much. It's that much of a literary masterpiece that it provides everything you need to know as you need to know it.
I completely agree. It grabs you by the balls and drags you in, and then you want to find out more. So why is Achilles so full of rage? The Greek army, led by Agamemnon, who is the king of the Greek, the top king of the Greeks, has been besieging the city of Troy in Turkey for 10 years. He's got all his Greek army there, and he's a sort of first among equals, I suppose. So he's called up other kings or sub-kings and heroes who have all brought their own contingents across to fight for him against the Trojans. And ditto, the Trojans they've got allies from all over Turkey and beyond who have come to fight with them. So there's this huge war that is happening outside the city of Troy, and Achilles...
What was it about? Why are they fighting?
You discover through flashback that what happened was that Agamemnon's brother, Menelaus, who's the king of Sparta, is married to Helen, who is the most beautiful woman on earth, and Paris, who's the son of King Priam, the king of Troy, has come over on a sort of diplomatic mission, but not behaved terribly diplomatically, because he's basically managed to seduce Helen and cart her back off with him to Troy. Now, this is treated as a rape, but it's also made pretty clear that Helen is absolutely loving it. She's not at all reluctant to go with Paris, because she fancies her pants off him, basically. And the Greeks say, give her back, and the Trojans say, no way. So the Greeks turn up with a massive army, and the war starts, and has been going on inconclusively but very bloodily for 10 years. At which point, King Agamemnon takes from Achilles, who's, as I say, is probably his strongest fighter, his strongest hero, takes one of Achilles', I guess she's a sex slave, really, that has been captured during the course of the fighting.
He seems quite fond of her. Is it a pride issue, or is it a genuine attraction issue? Because you're right, what's fascinating about the Iliad is the rage, that opening line, driving narrative, which kicks everything off, is about disagreements
within one
the
side.
Greek camp.
Yeah,
it's not the rage that Achilles feels against his mortal enemies he's been fighting for 10 years. It's more subtle, more complex, it's more literary already in this very, very early work of literature, which is to recognise that, okay, they're on the same side, but it doesn't stop them having interpersonal conflict, and I think that's so brilliant that this foundation text, this early text, recognises that Achilles he's in a sulk. He feels he's been slighted. He's still on the same side. He's not going to. It's not as simple as like, right, I'm going to go and join the Trojans. He believes in the cause. But
he's in a massive old
really screwed up here.
Yeah, Agamemnon has absolutely screwed up. No, he's a bit of a grumpy gruffalo, I think you could say. Achilles, this is the biggest sulk in the whole of literary history, isn't it? And there are several things going on in his mind. On the one hand, he does seem to be genuinely affectionate towards this Briseis. He does seem to be genuinely affectionate towards her. He also feels massively slighted that King Agamemnon has taken his prize away, and that's hurt his pride as the strongest of the Greek heroes. He's basically saying
Agamemnon has taken her because, if I recall correctly, Agamemnon himself had a sort of Trojan sex slave, but that she had been ransomed back to the Trojans.
Yeah, exactly. And he sort of says, well, I'm going to have yours instead.
Diplomatically, I've got to do that, but okay, I don't want to be without because I'm the head king, so I'll take the second best. Whoa, hold on here. You do diplomacy, but what's mine is mine, and in this case, what's mine is my Trojan sex slave. You barter away your own one, but not mine.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And basically, as you say, Achilles, he doesn't switch sides, he just says, okay, fine. Well, fuck you, I'm going to sit here in my tent, and let's see how you get on without me, and without my fighters. And
to the volunteer army.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm volunteering not to do anything.
Yeah, exactly. And basically, Agamemnon says, "Okay, I'm not going to give her back, and we'll just have to carry on without you." But the problem is that without Achilles, the war between the Greeks and the Trojans is clearly very, very finely balanced. The Greeks are stronger, but not so much stronger that Achilles sitting it out doesn't tip the balance against them.
It's a siege, isn't it? The Greeks are the stronger army, but the Trojans are encamped behind their walls. So they come out, and there are skirmishes fairly regularly. They can always retreat behind the walls of Troy. The Trojans don't have the power to come out and beat them in the field, but the Greeks can't go into Troy, and thus it has been for 10 years. However, Achilles withdrawing his forces really makes it harder for them to see that they're ever going to leave.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
In terms of morale, it's like, well,
it's pretty crushing.
We're going to be stuck here for another 20 years,
right.
aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. And
bearing in mind the Second World War, this epic story that is very much part of our mythology, and think of the countless films that are still generated now, only lasted
for 5 or
6 years.
Yeah.
They've been here for 10 years, and it's been, as you say, pretty bloody, and it just feels like, right, we're not going to get anywhere. So the morale in the Greek camp about Achilles withdrawing, regardless of what the other Greeks think about whether Agamemnon's right or whether Achilles is right and what's going on, I think there must be a lot of them just going, oh, for God's sake, will we ever get home? Because homecoming, and we're going to touch on this, is very much a theme of all three of these.
Yeah, they're desperate to get home and find out what the hell's happening, back at the ranch, basically. And in some cases, we're going to find out, and it's not good. This is one thing that I have a slight problem with, because why the hell did it take them 10 years to get to this? At this point, the suggestion is put out that why don't we stop fighting and we'll just have a single combat between Menelaus and Paris, who's nicked his missus. Let them fight it out, and whoever wins gets to keep Helen, and we can all go home and get on with our lives.
Well, I think actually we've reached that point. You're right. Why haven't they come to it before? And I think it's Achilles' decision which forces that.
Right.
Up until then, they've all thought, right, well, the Trojans are there thinking, well, the Greeks are going to piss off at some point because it's very difficult to keep an army in the field for 10 years. The Greeks have thought, well, we'll just starve them out. They can't get supply. It's taken absolutely ages. When Achilles tips the balance, it's like, oh my God,
right.
Achilles withdrawing isn't sufficient that the Trojans are going to win, but it sort of makes it impossible that the Greeks are.
Yeah.
There's probably a point where they're going, right, is there another way we can resolve this? I actually think that's the implied catalyst.
No, I think that's right. So, and another good reason to start the story here, right?
Yeah.
But disastrously...
We don't want to know the first 10 years.
Yeah.
What is it going to be? And I mean, there's one point, the only dull point in this, otherwise absolutely gripping, is you're right, you can pick it up and just go straight in. There's
book 2,
book 3 or book 4.
Book 2, the catalogue of ships. Oh dear.
Yeah, there's a list of ships, which is interesting, as we said, historically, because it reflects genuine Bronze Age disposition of forces rather than Homer. But as a reader, it's rather like that bit in the Bible where you go, I'm going to read
so-and-so, son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so.
The only bit that you're thinking, oh gosh, even on an audio book, you're going to have to sort of fast forward through.
Could his editor not have trimmed that? So I had there's an interesting suggestion or an interesting thought. I don't know if anyone else has come up with this. I'm sure it's kind of obvious. Someone must have thought of this beforehand. That basically what we've got is Homer's complete notes of what he would say at this point, but originally the Iliad would have been spoken, not read. This is an orally delivered poem, right? That basically he would have selected bits of that to say, depending on who his audience was, in order to big up the area that they come from. So basically, we've got the whole note of everyone, so Homer can remember it. But if happens to be in Argos telling this story, he says, yes, and the following people came from Argos, but he might have trimmed the other bits because it is a long old read, that book too. You know, if you're going to skip anything, cut through that, and then when you do, you get to this single combat between Menelaus and Paris. Now, disastrously, just as with Achilles sitting out, now the two sides are now quite evenly matched. Menelaus and Paris are quite evenly matched, so they fight, but it's a draw. Menelaus kind of is beating Paris, but then Pandarus, who's one of the other Trojans, shoots an arrow at Menelaus and wounds him.
Breaking the terms.
Yeah, which is not. Pandarus is a bit of not a terribly sympathetic character. Interestingly, he gives us the later word panda because there are other myths about him being a pimp. Basically, he's a bit of a pimp, and he shoots Menelaus. So Menelaus can't finish off Paris, so that the single combat decides nothing. At this point, Diomedes kills Pandarus, but then we've got these other heroes come in who are the kind of the other massive characters in this epic. So we've got Diomedes and Ajax, and on the Trojan side, we've got Hector, who is the kind of Trojan War leader, who is Paris's brother. So Paris is the one who's stolen Helen. Hector is his older, I assume, brother, and is the kind of commander of the Trojans. And there's also Aeneas, who is probably the second strongest Trojan. So in the absence, after Menelaus and Paris have fought to a draw, Diomedes then fights against Aeneas and is winning, but Aeneas manages to escape. They're quite closely matched, shall we say.
Now, it's worth saying now, Aeneas is going to be obviously particularly important,
right?
Not giving away any spoiler, because he is the principal character of the Aeneid, this much later epic, this Roman epic that we'll come to. But you've also missed off one of the important Greeks, I think, which is
Odysseus. Right.
Yeah.
And he's a particularly interesting character because although he's very strong and powerful like the other heroes, he is consistently described in the Iliad as a slightly different character. He's in the sort of top trumps of heroes, he would do okay on strength, but really it's his intelligence that marks him out. So compared to the kind of beefcakes like Achilles, Diomedes and Ajax, he's much more of a subtle strategic thinker. He's the person that basically drives the Greeks' strategy.
He's going to become the hero of the sequel. We'll come on to the Odyssey, but there's nothing really in the Iliad which would imply that we're following him.
No, that's right.
We're not really.
No, I think that's right. And so it's amazing that these two sub-characters, Odysseus and Aeneas, both have epics about them in their own right that are amazing. And I have to say, one is not disappointed about that, given their characters in the Iliad, because particularly Odysseus is very well drawn. I mean, we'll come to Aeneas later. He's really slightly in the shadow of Paris and Hector.
Yeah.
And Hector is the main Trojan character who starts to come to the fore now, as he realises that the Greeks are wobbling a bit, and he basically rallies the Trojans and persuades Paris to come back to fighting after his close run-in with Menelaus, and basically rallies the troops and leads them out of the city. Now, before he does that, there is the most amazing scene, and it's extraordinary to think that this is 28 centuries old, where basically he says goodbye to his wife, Andromache, and his son, Astyanax, who's just an infant. And I find this scene absolutely extraordinary because it's in amongst all of this martial language about fighting and gods and heroes. There's this incredibly moving scene where Hector says to his wife, look, I'm not necessarily going to survive this, but I've got to do my duty. His son, Astyanax, who's tiny, is frightened, isn't he, when Hector puts on his helmet? He's scared.
It's a real moment of literary... of humanity, as you say, it's sort of this poem is not just great kings and heroes and gods fighting it out in soldiers, and because you might be the sort of person who I'm already interested in hearing about armor and fighting, and actually you should be because it's vividly told. Yeah. But if that sort of thing doesn't appeal, this actual real sort of introspection and human moments. These are proper characters.
Yes.
With proper drives and individuals. And, I think that's something we're going to come back to.
But you could have taken that scene and put it into a Hollywood film about Troy today. Unfortunately, they failed to do that. But you could do that, and you wouldn't think that was anything other than the most up to date writing. And Hector this doomed figure who kind of, it's like he's doomed, but he does the decent thing. He leads his army out into the plain to fight against the Greeks. He fights with Ajax, who, as we've said, is the sort of, along with Diomedes, he's probably the second strongest of the Greek heroes. And again, they fight to a draw. So you're never quite sure. It's not like there's a very obvious pecking order. There's genuine uncertainty about who is stronger, but you get a rough sense of who. So you get a rough sense that the Greeks are stronger and have more heroes, but that it's pretty closely matched. And when Hector is kicking ass, which he now starts to do, the Trojans really can do some damage too. And so sure enough, they basically start to win, and they start to push the Greeks back towards their ships, which are beached on the shore where they've got their camp.
And of course, destroy the ships. The attack there is because once they recognise or demonstrate that the ships are vulnerable, they're hoping to break the morale of the Greeks because they need their ships to go home.
Yeah, otherwise
they
they're trapped.
Endlessly resupply their position, but also this is an army you mentioned of all the different Greek nations who've come together in support of Agamemnon and Menelaus, who's been slighted, and they are invested in that, but probably not to the point of never returning home. The Trojans are being quite tactical. Look, if we can show that the ships are vulnerable, then actually they might decide that it isn't worth it.
It's not worth the candle. And no, that's exactly right. And so Hector takes an interesting sort of strategic decision, which is that they're not going to go back into the city when night falls. They're going to camp on the plain, which is a real sort of balls out and all guns blazing. We mean business here, and we're going to carry on fighting tomorrow. And meanwhile, the other Greeks go to Achilles and say, for God's sake, we're starting to lose here. Can you please stop grumping and come back and fight? And he says, no, fuck off. It's exactly what I wanted to happen.
Exactly. You're right. Achilles sort of wants this. Here we might touch on the role of the gods slightly, because a lot of the action about humans calling upon gods with whom they have a personal relationship.
Right.
The gods seem to be aligned to either the Greek side or the Trojan side, but more specifically aligned to particular heroes within those.
And in some cases aligned because they fucked his mom or something, and some of these heroes are the descendants of gods.
Yeah, and so the characters of the gods are being subordinated to this story, this epic story, which is this battle is so great. It's such a fulcrum point of a timeless story of human endeavour, and so important for our understanding of the human condition that even the gods are involved at their most human-like. But I don't think it's necessarily a great resource for discovering what
Greek religion was.
What ancient Greeks thought about the gods.
Maybe this is a good moment to pose this question, because one of my very few problems with the Iliad, and by the way, I'm definitely going to be suggesting that this goes through to our top 100. I would say it probably should go through to our top 10 or 25, or this is just absolutely one of the best books ever. But if I have to come up with a criticism, I find that the gods stuff difficult, and the way that I cope with it is, and I genuinely think that this is there in the story, when the gods get involved, in most cases, if not all, you could view it as a kind of metaphorical thing. So, for example, Achilles, when he's having the initial row with Agamemnon, he reaches for his sword. He's so angry, he thinks he might just take his sword out and kill Agamemnon there and then. And it describes how the goddess holds him back. And there are lots of other points where the gods seem to intervene decisively, but you could interpret it as a religious rationalisation of the decision that the human hero or character is making.
I see what you mean, and I think that appeals to you.
Well, would it lose anything if you just took all the gods out?
Well, I think you're just a product of the post-Enlightenment.
Right. Well, of course, we don't believe in the Greek gods anymore.
Actually, this is probably an interesting point to talk about something which I wanted to, which is the concept of the bicameral mind. Now, I don't know if it's a concept you're familiar with. But there was so there's a work on human psychology by Julian James, published in the mid 70s, and his thesis was that up until about the Bronze Age collapsed, humans actually were not self-conscious and experienced their inner consciousness as a voice which spoke to them and which they responded to, which they rationalised in religious terms. That this is why ancient literature has people hearing voices in a way that we don't now. But rather than this just being that people in the past were more credulous, but this was genuinely how human psychology worked. And it was only post-Bronze Age collapse, which where there was a real crisis in the human civilization, human race, that actually self-consciousness emerged, and those two elements were rationalised into a single consciousness, which had the concept of introspection. Whereas previously that had been impossible. possible, and we encountered it as essentially receiving instructions from ourself, which we didn't recognise as ourself.
How interesting!
That's quite a complicated idea.
No, I think it's fascinating.
There's actually a version, a retelling of the myth of Troy. I think it's called the Song of Achilles, where this approach is taken, where some of the characters experience their mind bicamerally, other ones are fully modern, and lots of people are halfway. But his argument very much rests on the Iliad as being that Homer is essentially the first person who really, the reason the gods are experienced so differently, so unusually, simply as literary creations, is that it's the first time that humans are beginning to rationalise how those voices are, and he sort of conceives as the gods for the first time as agencies like that. It's a brilliant idea.
It's fascinating.
I don't know whether it works, because we saw that Gilgamesh was introspective himself. But funnily enough, I just assumed this was a pseudoscience, psychoanalytical theory, and I dove down into a bit of research, went into a rabbit hole, and actually, having been universally rejected when it was first published, it's actually enjoying a bit of a resurgence. And funnily enough, I don't know if you watched the modern TV series of Westworld, which is excellent, by the way. And the final episode of season 1 is actually called The Bicameral Mind, which is something I hadn't picked up on when I watched it, because it very much references that the artificial intelligence gained consciousness through originally experiencing their consciousness as a voice telling them what to do.
Really?
And that is the path by which they become it. So it's actually quite a rich idea, but it's all rooted in the Iliad. The Julian James, the author, puts the Iliad and says you can see the transition in the Iliad from seeing people's internal motivations, which they perceived as an external direct command, being then rationalised as internal motivations, which is sort of getting at the point that you said, what would we lose? Well, his argument would be, well, actually, Homer's actually doing that. He's doing that, but the way that he does that is by making them other characters.
Well, you know what? I was vaguely aware of the thesis, and I'd sort of dismissed it, but the way you've described it is very interesting, and you can actually see various characters in the Iliad as being at different places along that spectrum, couldn't you? So Odysseus is one of the most interesting characters precisely because he does seem to be thinking for himself. I mean, we're not talking about Hamlet here. You don't get interior monologues where he's thinking, what the hell do I do? But you can see him processing stuff. Whereas, to begin with, certainly Achilles, for one, seems to be the victim of his passions, his fate, the gods. Although even Achilles, by the end, he does get a moment of decision, which is, I can live this out, I can survive, according to the prophecies. I'm not fated to die at Troy. I could go home, slightly ignominiously, having been in this massive sulk, and I could live happily ever after. Basically, I could live out my life. No one will have particularly heard of me, except that idiot Achilles. We thought he was going to be a big thing, but he sort of blew it. Or I could be remembered forever as the greatest of the Greek heroes if I rejoin the fighting and die. And he ultimately gets the decision, and he can make that decision himself. So I'm quite sort of open to the idea that there might be something in this. We've arrived at the point in the plot where this is exactly where these crunch moments are approaching, because after the night when the Trojans are camped on the plains, Hector is absolutely triumphant. He's storming. There's this ancient Greek word which is an aristeia, which is basically when you, and I think this is a great word, we should have it in the English language, where it's not just the case that people are of a certain level of excellence and you can sort of predict how well they're going to perform. It's much closer to what we experience in real life, which is that sometimes you just have a fucking good day, and sometimes you have a really bad day. But you judge your heroes on what they can achieve on their best day. And Hector's about to have his best day, and he is absolutely on fire. And the Greek heroes, one by one, are wounded. So Diomedes is wounded, Agamemnon's wounded, Odysseus is wounded, Achilles is still sulking, and Hector manages to breach the Greek defences. He sets
He's
fire.
sort of 2 pints in, isn't he? He's that sort of level of competence.
Yeah, exactly. It's about where I am now.
Down. That's the moment. That's a sweet spot for me playing darts. It is ever so slightly sort of. Any more might be a mistake.
Yeah, and I mean, I try for the last 10, 15 years. I've tried to maintain myself at exactly that level of alcohol in my blood, and it's very difficult. Sometimes, you're too drunk and you're all over the place. Sometimes, disastrously, you're too sober and consumed with self-doubt. But if you could just keep that pitch of drinking level up, you can be Hector, flaming brand in hand, setting fire to the Greek ships with all your mighty Trojans behind you. And at this point, another Greek hero, who's an old buffer, basically, Nestor, who's from a previous generation, and he's quite a funny character, because I think there is a deliberate bit of humour here where he goes on a bit, basically. He's a bit like you when you've had more than your 2 pints, and everyone's like, oh god, it's old Nestor telling us again about how we should do things, because that's how it used to happen in the old days. But they also really respect him, and he basically is sort of begging Achilles to rejoin the fight. And at this point, the final driver of the plot kicks in, because Achilles, as well as having this sex slave Briseis that he loves, or at least loves to have, he also has Patroclus, who's his closest friend and lover. It's a bit like Gilgamesh and Enkidu, who we talked about in the last podcast. It could be interpreted in different ways.
I mean, many people have chosen to interpret it subsequently as if it's clear that they're gay lovers. And of course, we know that at a certain point in Greek culture that was very prevalent. They're certainly, if they're not shagging, they're certainly best mates.
Yeah, and basically what happens is Achilles says, I'm still sulking, I'm not coming to help you. But Patroclus successfully manages to negotiate that he can borrow Achilles' armour, and that Patroclus, can return to the fighting, and it's only Achilles who's sitting it out. And this is what sparks the chain of events that leads to the crisis of the whole book and the crisis of the whole war. Because Patroclus goes out and he kills Sarpedon, who's one of the greatest of the Trojan heroes, and is the son of Zeus, and is quite a big boy in his own right. But
Zeus being generally pretty neutral.
Zeus being generally pretty neutral, but he's very upset when Sarpedon dies, and I think it rains blood at this stage. It's sort of a moment of magical realism, shall we say, intruding on what is quite realistically described fighting. And then at this point, Hector is epically pissed off and kills Patroclus and takes Achilles' armour. And then there's a huge fight around the body of Patroclus, both sides trying to drag it off. Now, if Achilles was pissed off before, he really is now, he has reached... It's a bit like... Do you remember that time when your ex-wife, when we all went up to visit you, and there was a moment...
The Risk.
We were playing Risk, yeah. This is the only thing in the whole of human history, I think, that comes close. There was clearly a sort of thing where we'd overstayed our welcome, and...
No, it wasn't that. To be clear, we all understand that in Risk, all diplomacy is contingent provisional, and that when the time comes, you will turn on your allies, and defeat them, because ultimately there's only one person that can win. So I had entered into a pact with her, which was to endure a certain amount of time, and then obviously the moment that doing so was no longer strategically advantageous,
you shafted her in the back. Yeah,
I turned on her. I broke the pact, and clearly she had not assumed I was going to do that, which obviously was bad riskmanship.
Well, and indeed bad lifemanship, given what happened to your marriage subsequently. But it could all be traced back to that moment.
The sheer rage that I would have broken this agreement was untold. I mean, as you say, rare in human history to see. If everyone's going to write a sort of 24-book epic poem about it, it would also begin with the word rage.
Yeah,
Sing
exactly.
of the rage.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the only thing I've ever seen like it is my wife, when she was pissed off with a close friend of ours, and I can't unfortunately go into any details in case it becomes identifiable, but she posted something on Mumsnet, which, although it didn't use this friend's name, made it pretty damn clear to anyone involved who it was. And this thing went viral and became the sort of top story trending on Mumsnet. And then basically the next morning she sort of woke up and realised that this was going to have catastrophic consequences up there with the Trojan War, and had to contact the CEO of Mumsnet and get the whole post sort of taken down, which thank God it was. Yeah, it's a similar level of grumpiness, I think it's safe to say. And Achilles, he at this point goes absolutely apeshit crazy, and he decides, okay, at this point, you know what? I am going to return to the fight.
I'm back in the game.
I'm back in the game. And more to the point, I'm giving up on any plan of going home and living happily ever after. I know this is going to cause my own death, but I am so fucking angry that I am going to go back in. By the way, he's helped by the fact that Agamemnon, because he's so desperate about what's happening to the Greeks, at this stage he says, oh, you know what? You can have Briseis, the sex slave, back. And it's like, well, why didn't you say that a few days ago, because that would have stopped all of this from happening in the first place. But anyway, we'll leave that to one side. Achilles then has his own Aristeia, and he goes absolutely nuts. He kills lots and lots of Trojans. He's slaughtering people right, left and centre. The gods are joining in the fighting on both sides, and the Trojans end up running like the bloody hell away back into the city of Troy.
This moment Achilles finally enters the story, having really just been sitting on the sidelines, the great hero waiting to go, when's he going to come, when's he going to come? It's now. And as you say, this is the point where it becomes such a rumble that the gods themselves come down from Olympus, and are like, well, okay, enough of the sort of I'm sort of supporting from the sidelines and sending rains and winds and stuff. They put on their armor too, and it's like,
and they muck in.
Let's get ready to rock.
Yeah, and this is something that happens throughout the Iliad, right from book one, but particularly during these crucial books towards the end. You get something that is incredible about Homer that's very difficult to describe until you've read it, because it's so powerful, which is the degree of ultra-violence involved. We are talking about hundreds, literally hundreds, of named characters being killed. And they're not just, it doesn't just say, and now Joe Bloggs got killed. You get to hear for each of those characters exactly how he died. The spear entered through his groin and came out through his midriff, and his guts spilled out. He was still clawing at the ground. We
should spoil Game of Thrones, in case anyone's not seen it. But it's like one of the season, endings here, which is, where your main characters, the ones you've been sort of following and rooting for, are just suddenly killed. Anyone can go, and it's that sort of gripping.
It is, but I would say it goes even further than that, because in Game of Thrones, it's not, in Game of Thrones you get main characters dying horribly or whatever, but in the Iliad you don't just get main characters dying horribly, you also get, at the moment where some henchman gets killed that you wouldn't know anything about, you suddenly get a little thing about, and it was such a shame because, and then you get, a story about his family and how, his mum was a single mum and he was the only child and she brought him up and took the following sacrifices and, dandled him on his knee, but now he's there gasping his life out, puking up blood in the sand kind of thing. That combination of the graphic physical descriptions, but also the graphic descriptions of what it's going to mean to the family back home for each of these people is absolutely incredible.
Game of Thrones meets EastEnders.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, Game of Thrones meets EastEnders, but told by one of the greatest poets of all time, and it is visceral, isn't it? It's absolutely extraordinary. If you're worried about, I'm not really into sort of blood and guts or whatever, you don't come away from this thinking, this sounds great, I want to go and fight. I think you could interpret this as a kind of anti-war tract, really, because it is so horrific, and you're encouraged to confront the horrificness of it. This isn't just about heroes being heroic. This is about the cost that is paid by everyone else.
I think that's a really good point. In fact, I think this isn't a pro-war piece. I mean, if certainly if your objection to perhaps taking up this classic is that it's poetry and I don't really like that. It's not sort of poetry. This is not sunflowers and daffodils.
This is daffodils being splattered by blood and brains.
Yeah. However, as you say, I don't think this is just, even if we look at the Enuma Elish, which we did last time, where Marduk is fighting Tiamat and
with wind,
and it's all very this happened and this happened and this happened. It's not like that. There's the people go on journeys, and as you say, I think you might expect this earliest work of literature we have on a great war to be about this great army fought this great army, isn't it brilliant? But actually Homer's not like that at all. Homer, right from the beginning indicates maybe this is not all a great thing. There's a lot of sense of the waste of human lives, the number of people who are given over to the fates here. And fate's a really interesting concept, because even the gods could change things. They go,
it is fated. One of the things that's interesting about the Iliad is that it's written by a Greek for a Greek audience, but the enemy, the Trojans, are outnumbered, and that creates a really, really interesting dynamic. A lot of the tropes that Homer has created are still very obviously with us today in action films and things like that, but actually Homer's much more sophisticated. So in a typical Hollywood action film, you would get the baddies would be bad, and they'd massively outnumber you, but you would have a few
underdog, but you've got on your side.
And that is not at all what's happening here. Here, the Trojans are the underdog, and Hector is such an interesting character. You end up rooting for him because he's not as strong as Achilles. That's pretty clear from the start. He decides to ignore the fates, and he basically says, the fates say this, or the prophecies say that, but at the end of the day, you've got to fight for your country and your family, and that's what I'm going to to do. And then he hesitates.
Paris, who's potentially caused all this problem, so noting the elements that go along with this. All the other Trojans are just, this is where we live.
I'm fighting because you're here.
We don't want the Greeks turning up and burning and pillaging the city, so we're fighting for kith and kin.
Yeah,
here.
exactly.
It's the Greeks who've turned up in massive force to avenge a slight, which is really a personal issue.
Indeed, yeah, indeed. And although I think that if Helen was saying, I really want to go home, it might be a bit different, but the fact that she isn't means that for reasons of honour, the Trojans are like, well, hang on.
Do you think they know that?
It's difficult because you get some signs that they're a bit pissed off with Helen, but you also get signs that they're willing to continue to fight for her. And I think, isn't there a scene between Hector and Helen at one stage as well, and a touching scene between Helen and Priam possibly, where she's pointing out the Greeks that she knows from the walls as they look down at the soldiers.
Do you think the Greeks know? Because you're right. Because just the easiest thing would be if the Trojans said, "Helen, do you think about just come on,
fuck off back to
if you go back, you had your fun." But actually, they don't. By that point, they're sort of fond of her. She's married into the family, so to speak. But what's interesting is it a feminist question, a woman's right to choose her spouse, and
right.
But from the Greek point of view, do you think the Greeks fighting know that Helen is there willingly?
Well, I don't think it's clear, and I think that's one of the things that's fascinating about it. I'm not sure in those days that it mattered very much, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's the truth, isn't it? Yeah, it doesn't really matter.
But that's not to say that ancient Greek writers didn't explore some of those issues, and particularly when you get, as we'll come subsequently to the sort of Euripides and some of the later playwrights, those issues are definitely explored. And actually, one of the things that irritates me is the way that modern writers writing about the Trojan War, particularly feminist interpretations, think that they're doing something
recently. Particularly,
there have been lots recently. Margaret Atwood wrote one. We'll come to
but there's also been what's her name, who wrote Circe, and the name that escapes me. But there's written a whole cycle, and then, as is often the way, other people have gone, literary retellings from feminist perspectives about the Trojan War are popular at the moment.
I'll do another one.
And there's a whole slew of retellings with different perspectives.
And I think it's great to have these retellings. I think it's great to have different perspectives. But what frustrates me is the idea that this is something new. It's not. The ancients were already writing those. They were already aware of these issues and they were thinking about them. I'm not suggesting that Homer, within the Iliad, certainly, we'll come to the Odyssey in a minute, passes the Bechdel test. I'm not, there are not many female characters in this story, and those that there are do not spend their time talking about other female characters. But it is a bit more nuanced than you might think, certainly when you come to later ancient interpretations of these stories. But just to come back to Hector at this moment of decision, the thing that I find fascinating is that he hesitates, basically. All the rest of the Trojans have buggered off back into Troy. He kind of knows that he's not as strong as Achilles and that he's going to cop it if he turns and fights, but he also feels just disastrously compelled as the main Trojan leader who's led them out, and everything rests on him to carry on fighting and not run away. And then there's this incredible description of he sees Achilles in his bronze armour with the sun glinting off it running towards him. He says it's like a shooting star coming towards him across the plain. And basically, having decided, he does the brave thing of staying outside the gates when they close the gates, but then he runs away. And I think this is extraordinary because, again, this is so much more sophisticated than what would happen in the Hollywood movie, where the heroes from each side would confront each other or whatever. Hector's not sure. He runs away. He runs 3 times around the city with Achilles chasing him, and then he turns to fight, knowing that he's a goner. And I think that is the most extraordinary.
It's that bravery, followed by that, actually, maybe not.
Maybe not.
Actually, I'm kind of
that is so human, isn't it? We've all...
I have to fight... Because really, I can't keep running around here. That's brilliant.
It's absolutely brilliant.
It's so perfectly human.
I mean, it reminds me of that time when we were on Stag Do, where we ended up, completely against our will, although it was slightly your fault, in a fight outside a club in central Oxford, and you very bravely stepped up as our champion, but then ended up being ignominiously pursued from the field of battle by a woman who's about half your size, but while saying, actually maybe not, discretion is the better part of valour, shall we say. I'm not likening here your performance in that fight to Hector before the walls of Troy, but I'm just saying that the psychology may have been similar.
I think it's fair to say that the reason that fight went so badly was because you had shut the doors of Troy behind me, having promised to back me up into a situation which you massively escalated. And then when I turned around, I realised I was the only person standing on the plain of Troy, and everybody else was looking down, from the ramparts, going, "Go on, take them on."
I think that's I effectively identified the weakest party on the other side and said I picked him out. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so Achilles then, spoiler alert here, but Achilles fights Hector and kills him. And this doesn't assuage his anger at all. So he then abuses the body, straps it on the chariot, famously drags him round. He then goes back to the Greek camp to bury Patroclus and commits human sacrifice with Trojan captives on the pyre, which is a really extraordinary moment because Achilles is kind of the hero here, but yet he's behaving sympathetically, but by no means as a sort of Hollywood hero. And then the final, and I think very unexpected but very, very moving finale of the whole epic is that Hector's father, King Priam, who's an old man, takes the massive risk of going on his own out of the city, going to the Greek camp and begging Achilles, the man who's killed his son, in fact lots of his sons, but his leading son and his heir Hector, and begging him to allow him to take Hector's body back for a decent burial in Troy. And at this point there's this amazing scene where Priam and Achilles, who've both lost the things they love most, and who both know that they are themselves doomed to die in the next few days and weeks, see the humanity in each other and burst into tears. And Achilles agrees to allow Priam to take the body back. And that's it. That's the end. It stops there.
It's such an amazing ending. You might think, end on an epic battle, end on something. No, that coda does not feel like the Lord of the Rings where they shove in a coda because it undercuts the action. This is the perfect emotional moment because the poem, the story, has been so much more than you might think from reading a synopsis of it. It really has been about these human interactions, human relationships. There's the question of the human nature. That moment sort of encapsulates the sort of nihilism that is perhaps caught up in the text, the sort of the futility of war.
Yeah, and as you say, it actually ends in media res as well. But you know that the chain reaction has started that will lead to the deaths of almost all of the people, almost all of the characters.
That's the fascinating thing, because if you say to people, the Trojan War, this is the story of the Trojan War, and you say that people probably know this from reading, my first book, my Osborne book of Greek myths. You know how the Trojan War ends. It's the wooden horse. It's not here. It's not in the Iliad.
Yeah. This is really the story of, I think it's 9 days within the 10-year Trojan War. It's just focusing on those 9 days.
This very early work of literature does that. You'd think stories would be simpler millennia ago, but they're not. He's already achieved a complicated, and it's dramatic. Go back to EastEnders, bum, 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 bum. It's perfect, and that's it. That's the ending. And
dot,
so
dot,
my question
dot,
to you, if that were the ending, if we didn't know about the Trojan horse, or what comes next, would the story work as epically, or is that where we said before that you don't really need to know? You probably will be aware of some of the the story of the Trojan War before reading this, and indeed the original heroes would have done, but they wouldn't necessarily have to, because everything is there. But that's certainly true at the beginning and all the way through. But do you think it's true at the end?
That's a very good question. It does feel a bit abrupt, but what I would say is I think that knowing the bigger picture adds richness to it, but that it still works. For centuries, for millennia, people thought that this was a timeless story about a mythical war that described the human condition and the nature of warfare metaphorically in a way that could be applied and has been applied. People have thought about this across basically all the wars in the West that have happened since. In the late 19th century, heroic archaeologists, to everyone's amazement, discovered that Troy was a real city. Everyone thought it was just a myth. They found it. I've been there. And it was destroyed in a war. Yeah, and there's a destruction level that is about the right time. I think about 1180 BC, and Bronze Age collapse. The whole city was burnt. There are arrowheads and things. It was real, and so were the Mycenaean cities that the heroes are described as coming from. We found those and dug them up. So although this was written 400 years later, it does seem to be the case that this is an amazing story put together, clearly a work of fiction, but one rooted in historical fact.
It preserves tradition.
And it preserves a thing. Absolutely amazing.
It uses a real event, which was clearly of huge significance, as the setting to tell a timeless story. And actually the extent to which it preserves real traditions may be greater than we think. Clearly these characters are fictionalized, immortalized, made into great heroes, superhuman in some way. Clearly the gods are participants in the war, so there is a fictive element. But actually we already know, as you say, that some of this is grounded in real archaeology and real history, and who knows how much.
And who knows how much. I think that we'll come on to this when we talk about, in a subsequent podcast about the myths of King Arthur, but there does seem to be a thing where, you were talking about how civilization is perhaps a bit more cyclical than we like to think. When there is a dark age, a collapse, and then a revival, the stories that are then first written down about what happened at the end of the previous period of civilization, a few hundred years later, after a few hundred years of dark age, King Arthur, it's about the fall of the Roman Empire in Britain. In this case, it's about the Bronze Age collapse. Garbled memories of what were clearly epic events have been transmitted through literature into amazing stories of larger-than-life characters and heroes. And I do think it gives it an extra pathos, and it just makes it more exciting to know that this is not just complete mythology. It's grounded and rooted in something that was itself epic, namely the destruction of civilization.
You've been to Troy, I'm right in thinking.
I have been to Troy. It's a ruined city right on the edge of the Hellespont. You can immediately see when you stand there how strategically important it is, and that in any war between effectively the Greeks and and people who are living in Turkey, that is going to be a crucial place where people will gather from far and wide in order to fight it out over that particular spot. Amazingly, there are descriptions in Homer that are echoed by what we can see archaeologically. I mean, things like, for example, it is described as windy, and my God, is it windy when you stand there, right? There are bits where there's a moment, I think, when Patroclus attacks a certain part of the walls of Troy, where there's a join between different parts of the wall. It's there, you can see it. You can see Bronze Age sort of tumuli of burial sites, which have been remembered as the burial sites of the heroes like Achilles and Patroclus since the days of the ancient Greeks. Right, so the ancient Greeks thought that this was Troy and that this is where the heroes were buried. It's absolutely uncanny. I mean, the only problem is that Schliemann, who was the German archaeologist who dug this city up, was a heroic archaeologist before the days of sort of scientific archaeology. So instead of scraping away the top layers of soil with a toothbrush, he basically went in with a bulldozer and completely obliterated the whole thing.
Troy, which was the historic Homer's Troy, so to speak.
Exactly.
But not that interested in preserving, going down layer by layer.
Exactly, and unfortunately he went too deep, so he basically obliterated the late Bronze Age Troy and dug down to a much deeper level, and then was a bit disappointed by how small it was. But particularly given that a lot of the buildings would have been wooden and therefore wouldn't have survived, there was a major Bronze Age city at the mouth of the Hellespont. There are lots of ruins there. We know it was destroyed at about the right time. There are even Mycenaean pots, i.e. Greek pots, so there's evidence of contact with the cities of ancient Greece, and we've got evidence from everything from like Mycenaean to Hittite sort of records that suggest that there were cities and that there was conflict in this place at this time. And that's just, it's extraordinary. So I do like to think that Homer was having a distant memory of what was an absolutely epic event, which was the destruction of civilization in the course of a massive war, and that he managed somehow to take the disparate myths that had been passed down to him and turn them into this absolutely, there's only one word for it, epic.
You're right, and I think it's worth remembering that it absolutely adds that level of verisimilitude and extra piquance that it is historical, but it is a timeless story. There's a reason why this book has been recognised as foundational in the Western canon. It is still taught, it's a fundamental part of any study of classical languages and history. But I think people have just encountered it because it still forms part of our story of the West. If you read it, those characters speak to you. The novelty of what Homer was doing and what he achieved was recognised by his readers at the time and still now. I think truly incredible. And as you say, I don't think there can be any discussion about whether this makes the list of 100.
It definitely does. And I mean, I always think it's a good test of a great work of literature if there are great works of literature written off the back of it. And sure enough, there are. And not just the ones we're going to talk about today, but all the way through to the 20th century.
Well, you have sort of Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, which is based on a sort of medieval, the Middle Ages. There was quite a lot of appearances of versions of it. And quite interestingly, that for a while the Iliad was neglected somewhat because one of these texts, secondary texts which emerged, claimed to be a sort of diary of one of the characters in Troy, writing during the events of the war, taken later as being a an actual, historically what it claims to be, and therefore there was a period where people go, well, don't worry about the Iliad, that's just Homer's, somewhat poetic retelling about the human condition. We've actually got a day-by-day account, which is much better. It's like, okay. Fortunately, scholarship moved on from there, and that was recognised as perhaps not the correct way round.
Yeah.
But there's a huge number of secondary texts, and then they themselves have generated secondary texts like through Shakespeare. I believe the first book published in English and vernacular was a version of the Trojan War. Chaucer, and indeed, right up more in terms of the sequel that we're going to deal with, but it does have echoes back into the Iliad. James Joyce's famous book that no one's read.
About to read it because it's one of the all-time greats in itself. But yes, as you say, it's that is a retelling of the
Ulysses taking the Latin name for the character Odysseus. It is a retelling of the story of Odysseus and the Odyssey, which we're about to come to, but references back to events of the Iliad as well.
And is in itself arguably one of the greatest books of all time. It just shows you how fundamental this is to the canon of...
I'm sure it's on our reading list for several months.
Exactly.
Tell me, Muse, the story of that resourceful man who was driven to wander far and wide after he had sacked the holy citadel of Troy. He saw the cities of many people, and he learnt their ways. He suffered great anguish on the high seas in his struggles to preserve his life and bring his comrades home.
Well, so you've segued beautifully into the Odyssey, and I think it's time to talk about that. You've talked about sequels, and sure enough, there is a sequel by Homer. Now that was bold of him to try and follow
Iliad 2 this time. It's not war.
So I was thinking about sequels. What are the greatest sequels of all time? People say The Godfather 2 is rightly considered to be
medium res, told with flashbacks.
Very good. I also think Shrek 2, I just put a shout out for that. My father often points out that is potentially one of the greatest sequels of all time.
But are there any others? Where the second is as good? I mean, there's somewhere that's very, very clearly not.
Well, write in. It would be interesting to know what our listeners think about what are the greatest sequels of all time. But I think it is hard to deny that the Odyssey is in with a shout, because not content with having written one of the greatest books of all time, Homer, assuming it was written by the same person, I personally believe it must have been because it's so similar in terms of quality and the way it's written, came up with another one. And
it's somewhat greedy that the Iliad was sort of a shoe-in for the top 100. The Odyssey's it's starting for a pretty good position. There can't be many people that I think are going to have two
in there
without much argument. Although maybe there is an argument. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the Odyssey doesn't survive our list.
Well, let's come. Some people say that the Odyssey is not as great, or some people say it's written by a different person. I personally find it immensely powerful and moving. Again, I would put it into a shout, not just the top 100, but probably into our top 10 or 25. I find it very personally affecting. I do think there are differences in the way it's written. It feels to me more like that it's written sometimes subsequently or composed sometimes subsequently. Maybe the work of an older man, possibly.
It has a very different pace.
It's got a different pace.
But it's a very different setting. It's rather like, in those sequels where you don't want the second film to be exactly the same as the first one, but you're also slightly disappointed or discombobulated when it's not.
Right.
Or tune in for part 2 of a story where the whole tone, the whole setting is so completely different as to think, okay, it's interesting. So there could have been a second part.
He could have very easily written the sequel, which was about the wooden horse and the final destruction of Troy, but he didn't. Instead, he chose to focus on what happened to the character who came up with that ruse to finally win the war by creating the wooden horse that would capture Troy. What happened to him on the way back? And the thing that I find so immensely powerful about the Odyssey is that we've taken one of the characters, not one of the biggest 3 or 4 characters, but maybe one from the sort of second division, shall we say, of the Iliad, Odysseus, or Ulysses if you're a Roman, that was his Roman name, and just focused on him and how much he really wanted to get home to his wife and family. And that is such a universal, human, compelling emotion, particularly given that we know that he spent 10 years fighting at Troy, and it's going to take him 10 more years to get home, that just drives this story and gives it an immense power of its own.
We say it's going to take 10 years to get home. Again, this is not a story which covers those 10 years any more than the Iliad covered the 10 years of the Trojan War.
Right.
7 years that he's essentially not doing anything.
Well, he's doing something. He's basically a sex slave to a goddess, which sounds like quite a good deal.
Pretty early on and stuck. And again, this narrative, not quite as short as 9 days, but it covers a much smaller period, with most of it being told in flashback. And indeed, the Trojan horse, the bit which everybody knows from the story, is told by the character as a flashback. And in fact, actually, unlike the Iliad, most of the Odyssey is not actually told by the poet, so to speak, not by Homer. There are bits of it, but actually the vast majority is the poet saying, and then Odysseus spoke and did this. And actually a lot of it is Odysseus' own account. It's quite interesting, because you very much have a main character. What is an ensemble piece, the Iliad, with people on lots of different sides. This is a far more character-focused piece.
That's right, and it's so sophisticated in its narrative, as you've described, because it starts off basically with Odysseus' son, Telemachus, who is about 20, who was probably conceived before Odysseus goes away, coming of age, having never really known his father, and wanting to find out what's happened to him and why he hasn't come back from the victory at Troy, while his mum, Penelope, is being besieged by suitors who are basically saying, look, your husband must be dead by now, we want to marry you.
It's time to remarry. Because he's a king, he's a minor king.
He's a king in Ithaca, which is an island on the other side of Greece. So there is both a political and, because Penelope is a beautiful and accomplished woman, a personal reason why everyone wants her to remarry.
Interesting that Telemachus doesn't, who wants to go and find out, other people have made it back. It's not like there weren't any survivors. Right. The Greeks have gone home, we'll find out what happens to Agamemnon next week, but they have made it back and presumably have reported, this was fine. I saw him at the party afterwards. We all got together, and like that final scene in Return of the Jedi, we were all dancing like Ewoks. It was great, and we raped and pillaged Troy. It was fantastic.
Happy days, yeah.
And then he said, I'll see you back, next time we all get together for the reunion. And he hasn't turned up. And, they haven't found any evidence anything happened to him. So I presume, most people are assuming it was a shipwreck or something like that.
Right.
But for some reason, Telemachus seems to think, there seems to be an assumption. Many of the characters assume that Odysseus is alive, but hasn't made it home yet. Yeah. And it's not clear how they know that.
Yes.
They don't just think, oh, he's dead. They just think, oh, poor Odysseus, he hasn't made it home.
I suppose it was, in that period of time, journeys were very difficult. There was no way of getting news. You couldn't just ring up your mobile and say, "Oh, I'm on my way, love. Be another 10 years. Hope you don't mind." No one really knows what's going on, and so Telemachus decides to go and try and find out. And you get the first few books, which I think really big up the importance of it to what's happening with his family back home, but also serve as a brilliant kind of preface to when you finally get to Odysseus. So it seems so much more important when he finally takes to the stage. Telemachus goes to try and find out, and he can't really. He hears different rumours of what's happened, but he doesn't actually know. And then we cut to things from Odysseus' point of view. And as you say, further narrative complexity and sophistication, because Odysseus recounts his adventures and explains what happens over these 10 years, rather than us being told from Homer's point of view, he did this and then he did that and this is what happened. What we get is Odysseus telling the story to the Phaeacians, which is basically, he spent 7 years in a cave shagging Calypso, who's a sea nymph. And I've been to the cave, by the way. It's on Gozo, which is an island off Malta. Pretty spiky kind of cave. I mean,
that's what I was going to say. It sounds quite jagged. I mean, he seems to want to leave, but,
it's a good deal.
It's a fairly good deal. He doesn't know what's going on with his missus. So these thoughts must be going through his head.
Got a nymph in every port.
But clearly, you say it's the spikiness of the cave, which means
I
this
think
isn't the deal that we might think it is.
I was there with the missus, and we thought about a literary historical reenactment, and it was not. There were sufficient stalagmites that you wouldn't want to get it on there. So I think it was his poor spiky bottom that on these horrible rocks that he was having to have sex with this nymph, that he probably, I think that's my reading of why he suddenly thought, you know what, I miss my wife and family, I want to go home. So basically he begs Calypso to let him go. She creates a kind of raft for him and he sets off. So he'd obviously been shipwrecked on this island with this sea nymph for 7 years, and he's now set off on a raft, and it's obviously not a very good raft, presumably Calypso hasn't helped him that much, and he gets to a place called Phaeacia, which is interesting.
But again, I'm sorry, your humanistic tendencies are coming right here, because in your recounting, you're very good synopsis of the Iliad, which is an incredibly complicated
I'm leaving out the
text.
gods, aren't I?
You're missing out all the divine motivations, and you're doing it again here. I mean, his struggles and difficulties in getting home are not just bad luck, or he just happens to have been, kidnapped and get by a sex slave. He's ill-fated by the gods.
Yes, they're constantly blowing him off course, aren't they?
Part of when we deal with the Aeneid, he's offended people. There are gods and goddesses still smarting because they back the other side in the war.
Yeah.
And his responsibility as the chief strategist for the final victory. And there are divine forces preventing him from getting back. Now, you can choose, as you say, to go, let's get rid of that and recognise that as being sort of just a narrative way of describing, fate and luck and what have you. But that isn't how it's presented in the text.
That's true, and indeed one of the major characters of the plot is the goddess Athena, who keeps turning up to sort of help him, sometimes disguised as other people, like his friend Mentor. That's where we get the word mentor from. So she's sort of cross-dressing dea ex machina, I suppose, who's helping him out, and with whom he has a kind of weirdly flirtatious relationship. It's sort of like, Odysseus, what, you've got yourself into another scrape here, haven't you? I've come to the rescue. Oh, Athena, yeah, jolly good. What can I do for you? You can read it both ways, I suppose, but he certainly has a lot of bad luck, and it is explained. This is explained in terms of the gods constantly shipwrecking him and making life difficult for him, basically. And my God, he has a difficult journey home. It reminds me of the time. Do you remember when we went to Chichester to see a play? I can't remember which one it was. And then you said,
it was Ian Hislop's play on Trial by Jury.
That's right, yeah, and it was jolly good. And then you said disastrously, let's just get a quick pint in. You've got time to do it before the last fast train back to London. And one thing came to another. We were talking about it. We ran to the station. It was just pulled out.
Strangely, it's on some weird branch line, which makes it impossible to.
I
didn't know.
And I mean, basically, I then got the slow train, and then it was, I had a series of adventures over the subsequent years as I, roundabout ways got back to civilisation.
Afterwards, going, I think I've just passed a minor station. I'm going to go and try to get to London to get a pasty or something. And I think, we mentioned already, Ulysses by James Joyce, but I think, already discussed in our pilot episodes, which will be available, as a bonus content at some point, your literary endeavours yourself. But what you haven't done is clearly an epic retelling of
iconic South Central
and the Odyssey, about your train journey back from Chichester.
No one will ever understand quite how tough that was, but fortunately my family was still standing by the time I got back. Anyway, if Odysseus is to be believed, he has had a torrid old time of it that is up there with my trip back from Chichester, because he basically is in a shipwreck. His raft is destroyed in a storm, and he swims for it. And he's washed up on a beach, completely naked, lost all his possessions. He's absolutely knackered. He does a kind of mole in Wind of the Willows, and he sort of wraps himself in leaves and goes to sleep. And when he wakes up, he's discovered by Nausicaa, who's the princess of Phaeacia, this land that he's washed up on, who takes a shine to him, possibly because he's a quite a good-looking fellow, bollock naked as he is, just with a few bits of leaves, and takes him back to the Phaeacian court where her father is the king, and at that point he retells the story of how he's ended up there and what's happened to him over the years since Troy fell. And my God, is it a story. This is probably the bit that most people will be familiar with. It's a story of monsters and giants and witches and the gods sending storms, the winds blowing him backwards and forwards, the Cyclops in whose cave he and his men end up stuck. All of the classic thing. Yeah.
From your sort of picture book, perhaps, that you might have had when you were young or might have done at school. But actually, really gripping.
Yes.
And that's great story. In fact, I believe some argument that Homer may have incorporated some folk tales at this point, which were well known. And that when he came to put this story together, that he incorporated pre-existing stories, let's say of the Cyclops in particular, as a folktale, and made Odysseus the hero of it. And by this book, we may have therefore preserved a pre-tradition, an earlier strata of Greek legends which were in the rounds.
I think that makes
perfectly
sense.
edited together as a single story. And again, the humanity, the introspection, the lack of bicameral mind. Odysseus is a real character.
Yeah, he is, and he's such an interesting character. And nice things about it. I agree with you about the folk story element, and there are echoes of Gilgamesh and Humbaba and that sort of thing. There are also subsequent echoes. So Sinbad the sailor encounters some of these monsters, later on. So these were stories that have been passed down. But what's really interesting is how, so sophisticated it is, how sophisticated Odysseus is. So, for example, the famous bit where he meets the sirens, who are kind of kinky, sort of half women, half birds, who have particularly beautiful voices that you're compelled by the beauty of their voices and presumably the beauty of at least their upper half of their bodies to steer your ships onto their rocks. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, in many ways, if they're going to be like sexual seductresses, it would make sense. Like mermaids, it's never made any sense as that way round.
So you're one of the people. Hang on a minute. You're one of the people who would want. You would go for it if it was a bird with female legs, is what you're saying.
What I'm saying
you're a
is,
legs man.
They're going to truly be sexual seductresses. That has to be the case.
I think the mind boggles, frankly. I mean, I think that there are paintings of them as well, aren't there? I mean, is it possible to be attracted to something that's
drawn by Odysseus and time? I'm just saying, we need to. There are questions to be asked.
There are some serious questions to be asked. The thing that I love about it is that Odysseus, he does the sensible thing, which is that he all these men who are rowing, he sticks, beeswax in their ears so that they can't hear.
Yeah.
And then he gets them to... But this is the point. He doesn't do that to himself. He's a sufficiently interesting character, or a sufficiently kinky character, just taking your interpretation, that he says, no, I want to hear this. I want to see them. Strap me to the mast, which I suppose is quite kinky in itself.
Whatever I say.
And then ignore everything I say. So it's like, but I want to say, did he have a safe word?
Well, it's funny, I was just thinking that, because clearly he can't have had one, because had he had, he would have used it. But it's funny, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Where, because it's such a story which leaps out of the imagination. You go, okay, if I were in that situation, I really wanted someone to undo something I had told them not to undo under any circumstances. What would I say? And I remember, first reading this story when I was sort of 8 or 9, and we were just sort of discussing it in school or whatever, and we'll get onto, I'm sure, the sort of famous cartoon version of Odysseus' adventures. And you're going, wow, yeah, that's really interesting, sort of almost a philosophical problem. At what point do you know, I know I said this, but I really don't mean it. And then they go, oh, good one, it's not good. But then, of course, once you become an adult,
it's a whole different thing.
Completely,
Absolutely.
And suddenly, the safe word is Penelope.
That would be interesting. I mean, it reminds me of our friend who famously paid a couple of ladies to strap him up and, do some...
electrocute him.
Do all sorts. I think clamps were involved, all sorts of stuff. And I remember saying to him, presumably you had a safe word, didn't you? And he said yes, but the problem was
yes, please.
It was it was something like one of these ladies was English wasn't her first language, and the safe word he just a wonderful moment where he describes it as when she told him the safe word. He wasn't quite sure that he'd heard it properly or understood it because it seemed to be in a different language. And he was thinking, oh my God, what happens if I need to deploy the safe word, but I just can't say it properly? And then, she just takes that as, an invitation to double down on what she's doing to him. History doesn't relate.
The safe word, which
exactly.
Dangerously close to the stretch is slightly different to harder.
Yeah, exactly. As these things often are. Anyway, there is definitely some kinky stuff in here. I mean, the other thing that's kinky is the witch Circe, who captures Odysseus and his men, turns the men into animals, but then they basically drink some drugged wine, and then basically keeps him as a sort of sex slave for about a year. And it's quite nice this because
he spends quite a lot of his time,
in sexual slavery.
And tells him where he's been for 10 years. He's going to have to miss out quite a lot of how much he's kept as a sex slave. And of course, there's a retelling of this story. We talked about this just before.
From Circe's point of view.
Circe's story.
Yeah.
And again, I've just remembered the name of the author. It's Madeline Miller,
that's right,
who's done that, and a whole series of similar ones. But again, a sort of feminist retelling of Circe. Is she maligned by the traditional version of it? Or is she just a woman with sexual relations? I haven't read the book. I may not be doing justice to it.
Well,
but you're right. I mean, it's not. You say it's kinky. There's no erotic elements, or in terms of prose. It's more things alluded to. But it is incredible that Homer's sort of got there and going, I need to take 10 years the Trojan War. It would make sense if this character took 10 years to get home. What can I have slowing
At least
down?
8 of those are sex, basically. Well, according to his story. I mean, this is the other thing, right? And this is why I think that this is the work of perhaps an older person. There are more stronger female characters in the Odyssey, because you've got the Circes and the Calypsos, but you've also got Penelope herself, who, some people have said she's a bit of a kind of 1950s housewife. I don't think that's fair, actually, because she's portrayed as
she's
loyal. intelligent,
the suitors, isn't she?
Yeah, yeah, and
tricking.
she's tricking them. She's cunning. I know, which is exactly how Odysseus is described, is this cunning character, and the love between them is clearly based on more than physical affection. It's based on their respective characters, which are very close matches to each other. I think
it's obviously prodigious libido.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And indeed, the sort of sexual payoff at the end. Again, it's not described in erotic terms, but I think it's very romantic when they get back together and they renew their marriage, but physically as well as emotionally. Just one thing on this is interesting. All these famous bits of the Odyssey, which is what people think of as the story of the Odyssey, is actually only about 3 books worth, where he's telling the story of how he encountered all these giants and monsters and shipwrecks and how his men were all killed one by one. It's a tiny proportion of the book. And crucially, we're only hearing it from his point of view as he's telling King Alcinous, Nausicaa's father, the king of the Phaeacians, in order to basically persuade him to give him a ship home to Ithaca. And in other parts of the Odyssey, he tells a different version of what he was up to. A much more plausible version that is rooted in the same sort of world that the rest of the Iliad and the Odyssey are rooted in. Where basically, so basically, after he tells this story to the Phaeacians feel sorry for him, they give him a ship back to Ithaca and he goes home. And when he gets there, he meets up with a friend of his, well, a servant of his, Eumaeus, who's a swineherd, and basically tells a different story of where he's been, which is basically that he was a pirate and he was going around raiding and he went to Egypt for a while. A much more plausible story, both in terms of, just the fact that it's not kind of mythological, but also in terms of the historical record, because we know that there were kind of, sea peoples travelling around the Mediterranean at this time doing raids, basically piracy. And it makes you think, well, hang on, the one thing we know about Odysseus is that he's a cunning old bastard who is constantly making up stories. And I think it cannot but be deliberate that Homer has not told us this straight. He's put it all in Odysseus's mouth, and therefore he's
saying what he needs to do to elicit the sympathy of his hearers to get.
There is at least an ambiguity that did this stuff actually happen that way, or didn't it? And I think that adds a whole extra level of sophistication to this. That and as you say, is he going to tell Penelope about what he was up to with Circe and Calypso, assuming that did actually happen? Interesting. Anyway, he gets home to Ithaca. He meets his son Telemachus, and he realizes that the suitors are about to persuade Penelope. Penelope's running out of reasons to put them off, basically. But then, and there's some really nice touches, like his old nanny. I know I'm obsessed with nannies, but his nanny recognises him, very moving moment. His dog recognises him and then dies immediately of extreme old age and relief, presumably. But that's a very poignant moment. And then he meets Penelope, who doesn't recognise him because he's come disguised as a beggar, so that no one will know who he is.
And he's 20 years older.
And he's 20 years older, and presumably hairier. And I don't know about you, but I'm not the Adonis that I was 20 years ago. My body is the ravages of warfare and travel and so forth.
Well, your hair is.
It's growing in places that it didn't grow before.
And not growing in places.
And not growing in places that it should have done. But it's interesting that Penelope doesn't recognise him. But it's also interesting that he's kind of deliberately, because of what we'll find out in a subsequent podcast happened to Agamemnon, some of the other heroes. I think Diomedes as well had some problems when he went home. Odysseus wants to test Penelope. He doesn't quite trust her to have stayed loyal for 20 years, let's remember. And let's remember, it was 20 years when Odysseus, did not stay loyal, because he was busy shagging every sea nymph that he could get his hands on. So he tests her.
He's testing he's scouting out the tactical situation like a good soldier as to what's going on. He doesn't just come and go, back. Because he's not foolish. He knows these suitors are people who've been trying to wrest power. He doesn't know what he's going to come home to. And so it's very real. It might seem odd, having spent all that time desperate to get home. You go, well, why are you disguising yourself now as a sort of swineherd and, washerwoman coming in? But actually, it makes perfect sense.
It does make perfect sense. And I think this is another interesting thing as well, that we've been in this world of heroes and kings, but he disguises himself as a tramp, a beggar, basically, and he begs for food. And it is quite clear that Homer is saying that if people come as beggars, you should treat them kindly and not contemptuously, and that you should be generous to them. And the people who are generous to him, he teams up with them, but the suitors are basically beat him up and they mock him, and that makes him persuaded that he needs to come down on them like a ton of bricks, which sure enough he does. There's also, perhaps slightly more controversially, the fact that some of the maids in his palace have been sleeping with the suitors, and it isn't entirely clear the degree to which they were doing so willingly. but he ends up hanging them, and this is something that sort of 20th century and 21st century people who've written books on the back of this have from a feminist perspective, have really challenged. But I think, to be fair, there's a sense that some of the people in the household have remained loyal to him, and some of them have been deliberately.
It's about
tricky.
loyalty, isn't it? Yeah. Really, and again, interestingly, the revenge of Odysseus at the end. It is somewhat like that final moment in Iliad, where after a long slow burn, I mean, very different narrative structures, very different narratives, content, and the ending are different, but they both end with a sort of, there is an exciting bit at the end, followed by a sweet coda. Except in this case, that it does feel like a conclusion to the story.
It does, yes, and there are some people have said as a result of that the last two books of the Odyssey may have been later additions, because they feel like
an argument for that.
Yes, they do feel a bit like the Scourging of the Shire. It's a bit of an anticlimax because there's this extraordinary climax where he finally reveals himself, in both senses, to Penelope, who is also being intelligent and testing him. So even when she thinks, oh, maybe this is Odysseus, okay, hang on, I better check. What's our bedroom look like? Because only Odysseus will know. And then, because he is able to describe it, she's like, yeah, fine, you're Odysseus. And then they clearly go off and have sex. 20 years worth of pent-up sexual frustration is... For her, yeah, not for him. Yeah,
about a week for him.
How does she match up to Calypso and Circe? Interesting question. But he's clearly, immensely pleased to be with her. And then they take on the suitors in a final battle and kill them. And him and his son, it is, having been on this huge epic scale of the battle at Troy, this is now in a family and in a household, and yet it is still epic, which I think is wonderful. And I've got a particular soft spot for this because I read the Odyssey when I was on my gap year in America, and my now wife was back in England, and I was writing to her. We were writing to each other every day, and I was away for months and months and months. And then I came back early before she was expecting me, basically.
Disguised as a tramp.
And sure enough, there were suitors that she had been fighting off, and I took them on. And I think, epically took them on. You remember that guy that I chucked a pint over in the bar, and there was a guy that I attacked with a coat hanger. It was very...
I do remember that, yeah.
Yeah, anyway, it was epic stuff. But I think it really is... Everyone feels, who's ever spent time away from a loved one, will, across the whole world, will understand the driving narrative force of the story. And that's what gives it this absolutely amazing sort of sense of, oh my God, how long has he been away for? Jesus. And he just desperately wants to get back, and everything conspires against it.
Hundreds of named characters with individual motivations this time, but just one, if you like, motivation. That motivation is so much more forefront, but it's so much deeper and richer. It's vital, and it does feel like the end to the story, which began in the Iliad. Interestingly, of course, we have had flashbacks to the end of the Trojan War, which we wouldn't have had otherwise. But this is only one character, and he's not one of the big hitters. Agamemnon, we find out what happens to him in other works later. Funnily enough, for one of the sort of second division people, his homecoming in some senses seems, that's a great point, because Odysseus' longing for home is this timeless element. This element, talks about people who are displaced in war. There's been a theme, much discussed, which is that war changes people, and actually all they want to do at the end is to come home. And I think this is perhaps the first telling of that story, and I'd argue the greatest telling of that story. It's the idea that war changes people, and it isn't just we win the big victory and we dance with the Ewoks and the giant redwoods and everything's all right. It's not.
No, I think he shows clear signs of what we would now think of as post-traumatic stress disorder, and I think it's very interesting that he's such an interesting and complicated character. That's the other thing that drives this, and it's why you're really pleased that you're spending this sequel with him and not with Achilles or Diomedes or Paris or whatever. Because he's not just a nice guy caught up in bigger events trying to get home. He's very, very clever. He's cleverer than basically everyone else around him, but he's also, there are signs of he's not an entirely positive character, because he's somewhat amoral. He's quite arrogant. He gets in trouble because he taunts the Cyclops, for example. as we've said, when he confronts the sirens, he can't resist testing himself. He wants to find out about stuff. You definitely get the sense that he's not just a simple character who just wants to come home. He's kind of, one of the reasons why he goes through this epic journey is because he is an epic character who is interested in the world and desperate to find out about stuff, and it's hugely human and compelling.
The nuance and that choice of the intelligent character is you sort of thought that was the character. You thought, we find out what happens to Achilles.
Yeah.
Is the Iliad next, or
right.
or do the Trojans flee and we get a more of a sequel? And of course, we'll come to that in a second.
Yeah.
But actually, Odysseus is not the most obvious person that you might think would front up series to.
But you're
but
so
actually,
pleased
it's absolutely
that it does.
the right choice.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I mean, is it worth
If you want something different, you don't want another 24 books.
Exactly, because you could never match the Iliad if it had just been the Iliad 2 more fighting at Troy. But that raises a question. We'll come to the ultimate comparison at the end of this, but just at this sort of 2/3 point, shall we say, comparing the Iliad and the Odyssey, what do we think? Because I do think it is a worthy sequel. I don't think anyone's ever claimed that it's greater than the Iliad, and many people have said it's lesser, but I personally think that it is definitely up there. It's hard to imagine that two such enormously powerful works could have been written at the same time and attributed to the same person without a single guiding intelligence having played a major part in both of them.
I agree. I think, I suppose my view is it's a 9.5 out of 10 to the Iliad, 10 out of 10.
Right.
And one shouldn't take that as a criticism of it,
right.
because it's obvious that there's obviously incredibly brilliant, and it does something very different, and it is a timeless work which absolutely belongs in the canon. I think it is slightly lesser than the Iliad. I think the Iliad just achieves more, has its complexity of characters, the richness of its story, what it speaks to about the human condition. With all those characters, it is able to say more. But it's absolutely a worthy sequel. It's a sequel almost as great as it originator. And they really should perhaps be considered as part of the same cloth.
Yes.
But if you had to pick one or the other,
that's the point. If you're asking which one should you read, I'm afraid the answer is you really ought to read both of these, because they are, and that is not it will not be a chore, because
it will not be a chore. But equally, if you literally only had a chance to save from a burning thing, the Iliad or the Odyssey, I think
probably have to be. It's worth just saying, just for one more minute before we move on to Virgil, to describe a little bit what this is like, because we've talked about the story, and they're good stories. But it's worth remembering that they're also poems, and I've been lucky enough to, because I studied ancient Greek, to have read some of them in the original, and it's amazing to read them in the original. And of course, that because they're poems, the translations really matter, and we'll put some notes up of suggesting some good translations. These are huge, epic books, but every line of them is carefully crafted. The imagery is extraordinary, and one thing that I find really interesting is that Homer himself, about whom we know basically nothing, we don't even know if it was a single person, we don't even know if it was a real person called Homer. There's a little vignette in the Odyssey of a blind travelling poet who tells the story of Troy, and people have, I think plausibly, since the ancient world, suggested that this is Homer putting in a little self-portrait. And there's been a tradition ever since the ancient world that Homer was blind. But if he was blind, and if he was assuming he was a single person who wrote both books or composed both books, I do think that the visual imagery is so powerful in both of them that he cannot have been someone who's been blind since birth, because just you can picture this stuff as he describes it.
The scene of running across the lanes of Troy, glinting like a comet, the odd reference to the wine dark sea.
Yes, that is. I'm just as I'm pouring myself another glass of wine. It is a bit odd, that whole wine dark sea thing. There have been different theories of why he describes the sea as wine dark.
Well, you're right. His use of metaphor, it's so filmic, if we want to use an anachronistic term, although it has been proven very, very difficult to film.
Indeed.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I think the legend of Homer's blindness is one which has a sort of poetic resonance, that the person who is the greatest capture of this was himself. They give him an imperfection, as it would have seemed it, in order to. It seems a little bit too neat to me, but right. If it does preserve a historical tradition, I agree with you that it must have been one that was later came on, because his use of metaphor and simile is just superb.
Dios tetele et obule, ex hude ta prota diaste ten eresante, Atreides ta anaxandron, kai Dios Achilles.
the other final thing to say about Homer is that I think is really interesting is that it's a story, as we said, that is by a Greek for a Greek audience about the Greeks fighting the Trojans. But yet your sympathies, and I don't think this is just as an Englishman where we've got this sort of British love of the underdog. Your sympathies are torn, right? And you are kind of thinking that the Trojans have been pretty heroic and have had a bit of a raw deal here. They are not baddies. This is not these are not stories about good against evil. It's so much more complicated than that. And that is why it is amazing that then there was a sequel from the greatest Roman poet, which is basically telling things from the point of view of the Trojans. And this is where we come on to Virgil. So Homer, the foundational texts of ancient Greek literature, hugely famous and popular throughout the ancient world, including, not just for the Greeks, but including for the Romans. And the Romans sort of come along and they're kind of like, well, hang on, how do we fit into this story? And how can we ever do anything that matches the epicness of these epics?
Well, of course, the Romans looked to Greek culture as a sort of high point of civilization. They sort of adopted and assimilated it. So by the time of Virgil, the Iliad and the Odyssey were already part of the canon. Virgil would have studied them.
Right.
They were for them what they are for us, if not more so. But as you say, as Rome emerges as a superpower, if you want to use that term, it gets pretensions of feeling. And Virgil lives during the rise of the empire in the early imperial period, the early principate. We deserve an origin myth like this. Why is it that Greece, which we've conquered and has this epic tale? I think there's an element of inferiority complex very much going on here with the Romans, thinking, well, we may have brought the Pax Romana and achieved peace throughout the world and brought all these places into the empire, but in terms of civilization, we are not achieving what the ancient Greeks did. We are a silver age rather than golden age, and they don't want to be. They want this to be the true golden age. And that means that they need an epic narrative of their origins as well, and it makes sense to. No one's going to usurp or deny the Iliad or the Odyssey its place. So to have the other side's continuation of the Iliad, it sort of roots by sort of to jump ahead. As the Romans basically see themselves as the descendants of the Trojans, they can sort of claim a common origin in the Iliad. The Iliad becomes their story as well. Absolutely.
I completely agree with that. You may have seen and been disappointed by The Godfather 3. I really hope you haven't seen travesty that is Shrek 3. But the balls on the man, on Virgil, to step up and say, okay, one person has produced two of the greatest works of literature of all time, that are definitely going into the top 100, whatever. I think I can produce a work that basically riffs off both of those and is as great, or at least in the same ballpark, in order, as you say, to show that the Romans that they've got this origin myth, and they're part of this huge mythological story. And he basically pulls it off. I mean, it's amazing that there's a certain kind of chutzpah to his attempt, because basically what he says is, right, I'm going to write a book that is about the foundation of Rome, that follows the hero Aeneas, who's sort of Hector's second in command, shall we say, at Troy, and combines elements from both the Iliad and the Odyssey. So basically he does.
I think that's the point. Yeah, it's both. He's like, well, I'm not going to do right, we've had the war story, and now I'm going to do another wandering story where we come in at the end, Rome is founded. That's the Odyssey riff, if you like, is the first half of the Aeneid.
Right.
But he's like, well, but then I want to show that I can do the war bits as well. So I'll do it when he gets there. There are already people living in the promised land, as there so often are.
Right. Unfortunately for the Trojans.
We'll have a war,
Yeah.
And so the second, and I would argue less successful part of the
Yes. I'm glad you said that.
It's an attempt to sort of do the epic war fighting, and actually thinking, maybe you should have just done
an Odyssey style. That's very interesting, because he does basically, it's 12. Homer is the Iliad and the Odyssey are broken up into 24 books each, probably a long way after Homer actually wrote them. Virgil writes 12 books, and the first 6 are the Aeneas equivalent of the Odyssey, and then the second 6 are the Aeneas and the Trojans equivalent of the Iliad, as they are fighting the war that allows them to found Rome. And I'd agree with you that maybe the first half works slightly better, but my God, it is a bold endeavour to try and do both of these things in one book, and he does do a pretty damn good job of it. So Aeneas, we discover, has fled from the burning ruins of Troy with a bunch of Trojans and set out to escape from the Greeks. And like Odysseus, he is blown off course by jealous gods. And in his case, he's blown to North Africa. I mean, we think that Odysseus may have been blown to North Africa because there's an episode where he meets the lotus eaters and his men gobble down lots of lotus leaves, and basically they're on class A drugs. But it's more geographically specific in the Aeneid, in Virgil's telling, partly because he's writing at the height of Rome in a much more sophisticated society, so he has to be more geographically specific, and also partly because the Roman Empire that he is writing at the beginning of has expanded through a series of incredibly bloody wars, both with Greece, which, as you say, they've already conquered, but also with Carthage, which was the major power in North Africa. And one of the lovely things I think about the Aeneid is that he kind of creates a sort of mythological reason for why there were these incredible brutal wars between Rome and Carthage, which we'll come on to in subsequent podcasts. We'll come on to the historical wars, but this is the sort of the foundation myth of why those wars had to happen. So Aeneas...
Yes, he's building a mythology of Rome quite purposefully,
yeah.
And it isn't just that link back to the Iliad. There's other things which are being ticked off, and I think it's worth saying, here, Virgil, this Roman writer, is sort of doing this to order. We've mentioned that
right.
It's not just that the Romans are feeding the lack of proper epic foundation myth, and and this plucky Virgil goes, I'll have a go. I mean,
right.
it's more political than that. This is a sponsored, work. This is, a directed task, if you like, coming from right in the heart of the imperial circle, if not from Augustus himself,
right?
But from Augustus's
the first emperor.
But is it Maecenas, who's essentially his artistic chief of staff?
DCMS culture secretary, basically.
That's yeah. The work is sent out of order. It's like, are you the man to do it? He says, yes, I am. And I think it's interesting to see, as you say, he did that Carthaginian link. He's producing something which is part of the Romans' new self-identity, but it is a piece of propaganda. It is something to go to the Romans and go, right, because they've been sort of the Romans had myths about how Rome had been found, not least by Romulus and Remus, which obviously didn't exactly fit into the Aeneas story. So he's going to have to go out to, solve that. We're now going to put this out, and from now on, everyone's going to believe this is how Rome was founded, and this will be our. So it's fantastic, and we don't know the origins of why Homer came to write, but we don't, and the Bronze Age traps make that difficult. But there's no sense that Homer is trying to square a circle or to tick anything off, whereas the Aeneid, a magnificent piece of poetry, is a manufactured piece of work.
Yes, and I think, by the way, we'll come to this later, I think it does show a few signs of that, but I think a lot of those signs are positive. I mean, he's trying to, as you say, to solve a problem, because he's trying to explain Roman history, but also explain a foundation myth in a way that links it back to the end of the Bronze Age. And to be fair, there is some force in that. So he can't write a thing about Romulus and Remus, because according to the Romans' own traditions, they were many hundreds of years after the action at Troy, as indeed was the foundation of the original city of Rome. But there were Greek cities being founded in southern Italy, and there were Phoenician cities including Carthage, being founded in North Africa back into this Dark Age period. So basically he kind of creates or probably uses existing myths to kind of create this foundation story where basically Phoenicians from Tyre found Carthage under Queen Dido. Diomedes has come from Troy and founded Greek cities in the south of Italy, where there were Greek cities. Aeneas, fleeing from Troy, eventually ends up founding a town that is near Rome and that a few hundred years later will kind of turn into Rome. And by the way, again, very tantalising, there is some evidence both of the pre-existing myths that people from near Rome believe that they'd come from Turkey, and indeed I have seen, I think, linguistic and DNA evidence that there may have been early...
That's interesting.
Yeah, that there may have been early sort of movements of peoples at the end of the Bronze Age that included people moving from Turkey to Italy. So, it's absolutely fascinating. And I think he does a really good job of setting this all up. So, basically, Aeneas, who we've already met in the Iliad as a sort of second 11 hero, who steps up to the plate, but he's not quite in the league of Hector and Achilles, leads this sort of bunch of survivors, a bit like Battlestar Galactica, I think. He's rescued his father, he's rescued his son, he's failed to rescue his wife, who, as they're fleeing through the city, takes the wrong turn, basically, and there's this awful kind of description of how he sort of goes back and is like, well, why weren't you following me? Where have you gone? And her ghost appears and says, sorry, I took the second left, off Bread Street or whatever, and unfortunately I got a bit confused, and you're just going to have to go on without me now. Sorry about that. And poor old Aeneas has to escape. They get to the ships. They flee. They have a series of misadventures. It is prophesied that they need to go to Italy, and that's where they're going to be safe. And they get blown off course to Carthage, where he meets up with Queen Dido, who is founding the city of Carthage, and Carthage being the great traditional enemy of Rome. And wonderfully, and I think this sort of adds a whole extra element that we don't get in Homer, they fall for each other, and it's kind of, the sparks really fly. And Dido is a strong and, I think, deliberately sympathetic character who basically...
very much so.
Having sworn that she's a widow, she's sworn that she'll never love anyone again, but she falls for Aeneas, partly because Aeneas' mum is the goddess Aphrodite and potentially is working her magic on her. And they end up, again, they have sex in a cave. I mean, what is it with the cave fucking? I can't imagine a worse place to have a sexual encounter. But there's a really interesting thing where basically it looks like, from Dido's point of view, Aeneas has kind of popped the question, at least, or perhaps gone further, and she considers that they have been married, so that nothing bad, nothing dishonourable has occurred here. But from Aeneas' point of view, he's like, I never meant any of that, or I never said that. It was just a one night stand, love. You can't possibly have expected.
It would be like a farcical, it would be like a true farce misunderstanding,
right?
Were it not so tragic. Because Dido is painted so sympathetically, and actually that becomes the cause of
the Punic
both,
Wars,
driving the narrative, but also the Punic Wars, and that's what So it's brilliantly done, and you're right, it does add a depth, because certainly in the Iliad we had characters who were both sympathetically drawn at cross purposes, and that generated tension. That's less so in the Odyssey, where we're very much focused on.
You're rooting for Odysseus and his family in the Odyssey, aren't you? Yeah.
But here, whilst you know that Aeneas is your hero, actually, and it's something perhaps to come on to, he's a bit boring as a character in many ways. I'm sure we'll touch on that. And so some of the other characters, but particularly Dido, are
you kind of see her point of view. Yeah. Absolutely, and basically the other thing I like about it is it's not although they have this explanation that Aeneas' mum is the goddess of love, and that sort of that she deliberately makes Dido fall for him. The other explanation, the kind of human explanation, is that she meets Aeneas and he tells her in flashback the story of what happened at the end, after the action of the Iliad, what happened at Troy, when Troy fell. And my God, it's an amazing description, and that she's so kind of moved by it that she falls for him. And it makes sense, right? It makes sense emotionally and psychologically, because he's told such a damn good story. So you do see it from her point of view. And then when he says, right, sorry, love, I'm off to found Rome, I'm leaving you here, you can understand why she then goes, we've discussed Achilles, we've discussed your ex-wife, this is a whole different level of rage. This reminds me of the time I was driving with my wife to a family party once up in Leicestershire, I think it was, and basically I was driving and she was navigating, and that is a fatal combination, because obviously I'm a better driver, my wife is a terrible driver, but she claims that she's the better navigator. Now the problem with that is that obviously, again, she has a totally different moral approach to these things, where she thinks it's perfectly acceptable to cheat by asking directions, looking at road signs, reading maps, that kind of thing. Whereas, of course, like Odysseus, albeit it didn't really work out for him, like Aeneas, arguably ditto, the only way to do it is to set off, look at the stars or whatever, and vaguely go in the right direction until you find where your destination is, and you have a series of adventures on the way.
I used to keep a compass blue tack to my dashboard on the basis that
you can't go far wrong.
I know that York is sort of northeast of where I'm going for several hours. The roads will get there eventually.
Yeah, exactly. All roads, and eventually, and if you hit the North Sea or whatever, you've gone too far. Anyway, famously, my wife claimed that the reason that she got us horribly lost when she insisted on taking a left turn that I didn't want to take was because, and I quote, the map was wrong. Now, you can imagine how I scoffed at this. You can also imagine, and I really hope she never listens to this podcast, how embarrassed I was when I subsequently looked at the map and realised that, yes, we were using a 1971 road atlas, and believe it or not, the road system had changed. She must never know that the map was indeed wrong. But when I said, oh yeah, you're claiming the map's wrong now, we achieved a level of rage unmatched since certainly Medea, but I would say unmatched since Dido. I mean, when Dido realises that Aeneas is going to leave and that was it, she goes apeshit crazy, and she is not a happy bunny. And, she basically builds a huge funeral pyre, throws herself on it, and stabs herself for good measure, but before she dies, she curses Aeneas and all of the Romans, and basically sets in motion, mythologically speaking, the Punic Wars, the disastrous Punic Wars that will happen in centuries to come, dooming the two cities to fight to the death. I mean, it is an extraordinary, but I think quite sympathetic moment.
It is a standout moment in drama, but also in sort of sketching human characters and motivations. You're right, the rage and also sort of the justifiable rage in a way. While she has got the wrong end of the stick, not completely blameless. And again, we come back to this concept of fate. He's like, I've got to go and found Rome because it's my fate to do so. And of course, that's stupid. You could just stay here. I'm founding a city right here.
Let's do it together. Yeah.
Let's do it together. And I can't fate. It's a very frustrating answer, and she is, to say the least, frustrated. Right. So what happens next?
Well, so it's interesting. I mean, we hear from Aeneas that they have many of the same adventures that Odysseus does. So they go to a lot of the same places, encounter the same monsters, encounter the Cyclops, for example. They have shipwrecks and so forth.
The whirlpool.
Scylla and Charybdis, yeah. In Virgil, it's more obviously rooted in real geography, so Sicily and Mount Etna and the straits between Sicily and Italy. Interestingly, he doesn't encounter Circe or Calypso. I think that is an interesting thing. Now, maybe that's because that would be
almost that part has been taken by Dido in a way.
Yeah, I was about to say, yeah.
And that character, I think she, though not a witch, though, and because she's more sympathetically less obviously negative.
But she's a powerful.
But it fills that role in the story.
Yes, I think that's fair. And then, we actually didn't talk about this in Odysseus. There's an amazing moment in the Odyssey where Odysseus goes down to the underworld as Gilgamesh and Enkidu. There's a similar moment, but in the Odyssey, Odysseus goes down to the underworld and meets, amongst other people, the wonderful character who is a very minor follower of Odysseus, who just basically got drunk, fell asleep on a roof of a tavern or something, woke up, went for a wee and fell off the roof and died in the least heroic moment ever. And it's a lovely touch that he's in there. Similarly, there's a character called Palinurus, who's one of Aeneas's colleagues, who's basically he's the guy steering Aeneas's ship, and he dies in a really stupid way, which is basically he falls asleep while he's steering the ship. As a naval man, you'll feel sympathetic for this, and he's basically got no excuse. He just got really knackered and he fell asleep, and he kind of and then he fell overboard, and Aeneas meets him. But I do think that this, it's powerful in the Odyssey, but the book where Aeneas goes down to the underworld is immensely powerful, and
yes, and it raises up, I think, because it is obvious that he is quite deliberately ticking off to make sure that Aeneas has character adventures like Odysseus does, and everyone would have known that because they would have been familiar with Baisae. But
he goes further somehow, doesn't he?
But go to the other. He takes it to another level. The skill that he does is arguably better, and or holds its own at least, and does something different with it, and that difference is a really positive one, and that's the only thing which justifies as being a sort of greatest hits version of because the Aeneid could have gone horrifically wrong. It could have just been a pale imitation, and one shouldn't utter it in the same breath as the other works we've looked at, but it doesn't. It holds its own because Virgil is an incredibly skilled poet. In his own right.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the thing that adds the whole extra dimension to this underworld bit is that Dido is down there waiting for him, and
Exeter party,
Yeah, exactly.
I've had genuine.
We've all been there.
I remember turning up at a ball once, and there's just absolute crushing realisation. As I was there with a new partner, and saw an ex, and you just thought, right, I'm going to have to explain, essentially. And there's no reason, of course, why the new partner should be upset that the old partner is there, because, I don't need to talk to her, but it's just, it's never good. Or an event which happened, which is almost exactly like the scene in Four Weddings and a Funeral, where I went to a wedding once, and quite deliberately, I am sure, as a hilarious joke, the bride, who I was the friend of, had managed to sit me on a table full of ex-girlfriends.
Oh, God. That is not a happy place to be sat. Yeah, it's awkward. awkward. And of course, it's particularly awkward because the reason Dido's in hell is because she killed herself when Aeneas left, which he didn't know. He left. He didn't know what had happened to her. So it's an awkward moment, but it's very powerfully done. But the other thing that happens down there is that he meets his father's ghost. His father has died of old age, and there is revealed to him the future fate of Rome. And this is really interesting as well because it's written at the beginning of the empire. We've just had the end of the Republic. It is written for Augustus, really, and it is explaining the future glory of Rome up to the moment of the then contemporary politics of Augustus and his recent victory at Actium over Mark Antony, and the death of his adopted father Julius Caesar, and so forth. But what's amazing about it is, as this ends the first half of the Aeneid, there's this incredible description where he says, this is the very end of book 6, he says, there are 2 gates of sleep, one said to be of horn, whereby the true shades pass with ease. The other is all white ivory, gleaming without a flaw, and yet false dreams are sent through this one by the ghosts to the upper world. Now Anchises, that's Aeneas' father, his last instructions given, took his son and the Sibyl and let them go by the ivory gate. And that's the end of the thing. In other words, it's sort of surprising when you read it because it's beautiful description of the underworld, this kind of crazy, almost incomprehensible but very poetic description of the land of the dead. But what's fascinating is that you expect that he would presumably come through the gate of horn, but he doesn't. He comes back through the gate of ivory, and we'll come on later to what that might mean and the degree to which, amidst this kind of slightly willy-waving, well, look, the future of Rome is as follows and it's going to be amazing, that there's definitely some ambiguity in there about what does Virgil really think about the future of Rome? What does he really think about Augustus? So that's it. So we've had these first 6 books. I think that there's an argument that the even-numbered books are particularly powerful. So that's the book 2 where he's describing what happened to Troy, book 4 where he's describing Dido kills herself, and book 6 where he goes to the underworld are, I think, that the standout moments in the Aeneid. They're amazing. And I think that was recognised at the time because there's this story of how he and Maecenas read these books to Augustus himself. These are the best bits, shall we say. It's like the pulling out the best scenes for the theatrical trailer.
So are you getting at the idea that, they are the best bits, but are you getting at the idea that he's also deliberately not reading certain bits to Augustus? Because there's an argument.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
That it's not one that I necessarily buy into, but I've heard it argued that actually there's actually a subtle criticism of the Augustan settlement in this work. I struggle with it. You've heard? Could you explain it better to me?
Yes, I can, and it will probably come out if we can go on to talk about the war that takes up the action of the second part of the book and how that war ends. That's probably the best moment to really explore this, but it's worth having raised that flag now to keep it in the back of your mind, particularly given what you said a moment ago about how Aeneas, he's no Odysseus, is he? He's not a 100% sympathetic character, and
I don't think he's as well sketched as Odysseus.
He's not as well sketched, no.
Odysseus is comes across as a real personality, the sort of person you want to go to the pub with.
Right. Yeah.
Aeneas, and I think this is
some terrible shit might happen to you if you did go to the pub with him, because his companions don't tend to come out very well. But yeah, you could imagine standing him a drink.
But I think it's the difference between the Greek and the Roman virtues. Odysseus' heroism is his key identity.
His intellect.
For the Romans, it's this sense of pietas, there's some faithfulness, that he's dutiful, which is all very laudable, of course, but a bit less interesting.
And it's less sympathetic as well, isn't it? It's like, oh, I'm going to leave my wife and burning city behind because it is my duty to found Rome. Oh, I've met up with this really quite interesting bird and shagged in a cave, but it is my duty to go and found Rome, so I'm going to leave her there. And then all the way through, it does feel a little bit... But again, I just wonder whether there's an element of deliberateness here, that Aeneas is the hero that Augustus would have wanted, but Virgil portrays him in a way that is a little bit ambivalent in terms of our sympathies. Now, maybe that's just... it's not so interesting because they're Romans. Maybe it's not so written in such an interesting way, so it's harder to root for him. But I do detect a few places where it's hard not to think that the poet agrees with you in your interpretation. And I think that comes out more in, as I say, we'll come to in the end of the war that is to follow. So basically, the prophecies all the way through have been that Aeneas has to go to Italy and found what is going to turn into Rome. And the moment at which he knows that he's going to have landed in the right place and this is the place to build the city will be, according to the prophecy, when the Trojans are so hungry that they eat their own plates. And this is absolutely wonderful, this bit, because it's like a kind of origin myth for the pizza, because they land in Italy finally after all these adventures, and they're bloody hungry, and they make what is effectively a prototype pizza, where it's sort of hard bread with bits on top, like a trencher, I suppose, in the Middle Ages, where you would have. It was designed just that you'd eat the bits on top, but they're so hungry that they eat the base as well and the crust, and that's the moment that they realise, oh, this is where we need to found the city. But unfortunately,
so it's not just the Punic Wars which have a mythological origin.
It's also the pizza.
It's
right.
also the pizza.
But unfortunately, there are people there living there already, and they are not particularly pleased that these Trojans have just turned up. Come here, you take our jobs. And so Turnus, who is the sort of hero of the existing Latins, who are the people who live there, the indigenous population, basically rouses up a kind of faragist rump to take on the Trojans. The Trojans, meanwhile, make common cause with some of the people who don't like Turnus and his crew, and they fight a massive war. And it is clearly trying to be shades of the Iliad. At one stage, the hero Diomedes is called on to join in the fighting, although he's basically had enough and he's retired. He's not up for it. And it is great, and it's definitely extremely compelling. It doesn't quite hit the Iliad levels of
I think
compellingness.
I think the Odysseus-like bits, the sea journey, does actually at times come to equal and rival the Homer's work. Don't get me wrong, the last 6 books are brilliant, absolutely. But I think it since that he is trying to something to ape and riff off the Iliad, that's pretty a pretty tall order, since it is the greatest work,
right, and greatest description of fighting and so forth. Yeah.
So a worthy effort, but also perhaps if you didn't know that, if the Aeneid just stood by it in its own right. I wouldn't feel that way. I think it's more that now I'm turning to book 6 onwards, where we're basically going to have a sort of Roman version of the Iliad, and it's not as good. But that's actually perhaps something I'm bringing to the text rather than a problem with the text itself, which is superb.
It'd be interesting to know what it would be like to read the Aeneid having not read the Iliad. I don't know if there's anyone who's ever done that. Well, presumably
if you haven't, listeners, if you haven't actually read any of these things, and you're hoping to, could at least a few of you please volunteer to do that, and let us know.
Absolutely. I mean, there are a couple of elements that are different and interesting. One of which is there's an Amazon character, Camilla, who is extremely sort of attractive in both senses, shall we say. Now, to be fair, in the Homeric myths, but not in the actual Iliad, there are Amazons fighting with the Trojans. But this is a strong female character who is fighting with Turnus against Aeneas, and she's described as this amazing warrior who is so fleet of foot that she can run along the tops of blades of grain without sort of sinking through, but she is killed, and I think that there is some sympathy with her, which is interesting coming from a Roman. There's a moment where Aeneas, as Achilles had done in the Iliad, kills some hostages. Problematic, I think you could safely say. And then it all comes down to this final battle with Turnus, a sort of one-on-one fight, just like Achilles fighting Hector. But again, you're kind of sympathetic towards Turnus. I mean, he's doomed, he's doomed. There's a moment at the end where he begs Aeneas to save him, and Aeneas says no and kills him, and that's the end. The end. That's the final line.
I think that's the problem, because I think one of the great things about the Aeneid is that, we said it before when we talked about the Iliad, is that, you want to root for the underdog. The Greeks are not the underdogs in the story of the Iliad. And so what makes it so brilliant is they're sort of the heroes, but it's a bit more complex than that. And, I don't know if it's a British trope or more universal to sort of root for the underdogs. And you do that, for the Trojans. And so it's great to see what happens to them, and they go off on their adventures, and they're going to go and find a home. I think for me, it's the point at which the home is occupied, where suddenly you're going, whoa, okay, you're not the underdog anymore here.
Right.
It's all sort of destined to be. As you say, it's just that final battle when suddenly, actually, hold on, the indigenous Latins are the underdogs. And I find my loyalties perhaps switch at that point.
Yes, and
I'm not sure that I want Aeneas to win.
I completely agree. And having had the genius sort of thing that, okay, the Trojans could be the heroes and they're the underdogs, but you're rooting for them, to throw it away, I think he missed a massive trick by not getting Diomedes involved, because Diomedes is there, he's in southern Italy, Turnus basically sends a sort of thing saying, do you want to come in and have another crack at these Trojans? We know that Diomedes kicks ass, and specifically is stronger than Aeneas. If they'd brought him in with a bunch of Greeks to fight against the Trojans, then you'd have had a real fight on your hands. But presumably for political and historical reasons, Virgil decides not to do that, and I think that is a bit of a missed
has
trick.
This sort of proto-Etruscan, the Etruscans being there. But actually, if it had been a final fight of the last remnants of the Greeks and they had beaten them, I don't know. I think that, it's arrogant to rewrite Virgil, but I think that would have sort of given the whole thing, the whole story at the beginning of the Iliad, an ending that I think might have worked.
Yes, but that's why I think that I like my sort of reading. It's not just me. I mean, lots of people have said this, that there is a deliberate undercutting here from Virgil, that he's basically Aeneas right at the end. He doesn't spare Turnus, and that reveals something about the Roman character. This is the hero that has effectively founded Rome. The Augustan, he's the embodiment of the Augustan virtues, and yet he has shown himself to be ultra-violent, not forgiving, too scarred by war. And is Virgil saying something here about Rome and about Augustus's Rome? And put that together with those last lines of the first half, the sort of Odyssean half, is there something here that is basically surreptitiously critical? Augustus didn't think as much, although it is also worth noting, and I think this is absolutely fascinating, that Virgil was the first person that we know who did this thing of saying on his deathbed, burn the manuscript, it's not worthy. Unfortunately, his his literary executors said, no way are we going to burn this, it's absolutely amazing. There are potential explanations one way or another of why he might have said that. Was it unfinished? There are a couple of lines that are unfinished. It's very, very carefully sculpted. Is that how he intended to end it? Was he worried about what Augustus would have made of that ending? We just don't know. But that in itself adds a whole extra level of interest, I think, to this. Now, there's one other thing that...
It's fascinating. It is. I find it... I don't know, just because the Augustan age was such a dangerous place to start criticising Augustus, even if you're doing it with the subtlety of Virgil, Augustus himself was not a stupid person anymore than was Maecenas. So I'm not wholly convinced, but I think there might be something in it.
So there are two other things about Virgil that are worth knowing. One is this very silly story that is almost certainly apocryphal, but I just really think it's a really nice story, which is that Virgil, who we think was probably gay, by the way, but this story has him as a heterosexual. He falls in love with a beautiful woman, sometimes described as maybe the emperor's daughter, and she basically plays him along. This is when he's an old man. Plays him along, says, come to my room or whatever late at night, and I'll lower a basket out of my window, and you can sort of, it's like Romeo and Juliet sort of thing. Get in the basket and come up, and then, we'll do the business. And he falls for it, doesn't realise what a tragic old man he is. This sounds like one of your adventures. Climbs into the basket. She drags him halfway up and then leaves him dangling there, and he's still there trapped in the basket the next day for everyone to come and laugh at. This was sort of one of the myths of something that happened to Virgil. I mean, it's almost certainly untrue, but of course, but it's just a nice little story, and it does make you think about, basically, if you're in doubt, if someone lowers a basket down, you need an exit strategy, otherwise you might end up like that.
It's all about the exit strategy.
The other thing that's worth saying is that for many years in the Middle Ages, people thought that the Aeneid was itself a magic book, and that people would try to predict the future by opening a copy of the Aeneid at a random page, pointing to a sentence, having asked a question, and then basically say, okay, what the Aeneid says will come true. People believed this for centuries. So I thought it might be interesting to do this as a test. My question for you is, what are you having for dinner? And I want you to predict that by opening the Aeneid at a random page and pointing to a sentence.
Right. It says, move as you must from this place. It's not this land, the Delium suggested. Crete's not the place where Apollo's instruction advised you to settle, but such a place does exist. It's an ancient land called Hesperia, twilight land by the Greeks, strong in armies, rich in its crop fields. So some sort of Italian, I imagine.
Amazing. So basically, you're not going to have a kebab for dinner. You're going to have a pasta or pizza. And amazingly, I have just done the same test myself. Now, clearly, this is because my copy has opened at a page that where I've cracked the spine. But it's that bit where they have just landed on the shores of Italy and they eat their own tables. Aeneas' son said, what? We eat our own tables too? And then they realised that they've eaten the first pizza, which I think is another, that is the gods telling us that I'm having pizza for dinner.
Well, So I had pizza last night, so it's possible that the magic is ever so slightly off. I think it's salad within this night, but it's definitely, nearly there.
Arms I sing, and the man who first from the shores of Troy came, fate exiled, to Italy.
Right.
How do we rate Virgil compared to Homer, and are there any shortcuts?
Right, so I've been on a journey, as they like to say here. I think I came into this, I've always been a little more interested in Latin literature and Roman culture, but I come out of this quite converted.
Hey!
Probably the Homer it is the better work, but I mean, Virgil is superb. I mean, it's his churlish to try and find distinctions in this, but if I was to use my system before, 10 out of 10 for the Iliad,
Yep.
9.5 for the Odyssey, and 9.25
Right.
for the Aeneid. But you're comparing, the great works of Western and indeed human literature, which rightly deserve their positions.
I couldn't agree more, yeah. And we're not
Yeah,
Charles
so-
here. So hang on, are we setting a disastrous new precedent here? Because I don't see how we can abandon any of these, really. I mean, how can we possibly not have all three of these in the top 100? All three have got to go through. They've got to.
Although I wouldn't necessarily suggest for people who are trying to get into, using this podcast as a route into becoming more literate and gaining a more understanding of this 5,000 years of human civilization, necessarily doing what we have done and trying to read all three of these back to back. Because
Interesting.
Brilliant though it was, it was
It's
pretty
a
hard
lot,
going.
a lot of it. Yes, I see that. Although I do think, particularly if you're, let's say, you're a teenager who is getting into literature for the first time, I think this is a damn good place to start because it explains so much of what comes afterwards, and also it's just fucking good.
It is. Just don't do it in a week.
So yeah, don't do it in a week. I know, it's been a tough week. The other thing, as I'd say, is unfortunately these are so good you don't need shortcuts, but the shortcuts are shit. I mean, there have been films of this. We've said how cinematic it is. There's the Troy film that came out in about 2004. I cannot bring myself to watch it just from the trailer. It's so shit. There was a BBC series, ditto. There's like a Kirk Douglas film of the Odyssey, I think. All of them just look shit to me. I don't know what.
Hold on, there's a noticeable exception, which is Ulysses 31, Franco-Japanese, popular TV series of the 1980s, which retells the story of Ulysses as it's set in the 31st century with his son Telemachus on the spaceship of the Odyssey. I mean, it's fair to say it takes some liberties with the text.
It's set in the 31st century for start.
Most of the main events.
It really is amazing. And by the way, I mean, I'm indebted to you for this, for getting the DVD, because I remembered this with great affection from my very early childhood, but it definitely stands up. My God, that is a good series. I mean, that is a good shortcut. I don't do it instead of, but do it as well as.
I know, funny they're quite interested in a rewatch now that I've actually, rather than have, the Iliad and the Odyssey, or particularly the Odyssey, as sort of, I kind of know the story because I grew up in here and I was lucky enough that my school sort of, focused on it a bit. But actually having read the text now, primary text, I think it's going to be fascinating to go back and rewatch those 20 episodes that there are, or whatever, or 24 if I'm to be honest, and see the links there, which I wouldn't have necessarily got first time round.
No, I completely agree. And by the way, I do think it's one of those things that's better for adults than for kids, because I showed my kids, they were really obsessed with it, but they were fucking terrified by it, and they had terrible nightmares, and it's so powerful. And it's odd, but isn't it odd that it's better than the other thing? I mean, by the way, there's a 1962 film of the Aeneid called Avenger, which is actually not as bad perhaps as the Brad Pitt Troy thing, but it's interesting that the straight tellings by Hollywood of these stories haven't worked, but there's something as weird as a Franco-Japanese cartoon set in the 31st century is better. Ditto, as we'll come on to, and I'm very much looking forward to rereading The Joyce off the back of this. The day in the life of a funny little Dubliner in 1906, but told through the prism of the story of Ulysses, as one of the greatest novels of all time, which I'm definitely putting it forward as.
Well, do you think that might be that there's nothing to add by a retelling of it? It can only be less. But actually, there's ones which have taken them as done twists on it, or taken as a starting point or a free retelling. I mean, Ursula Le Guin did a novel, Lavinia, or based on the Aeneid. Actually, on the last 6 books of the Aeneid.
I haven't read it.
But
the least interesting character in the whole thing, she deliberately picks on.
Yeah, and I've not read it, but I think the people who go back and find interesting things in it, in these rich universes, these rich worlds which Homer and Virgil have built up. There's good stuff in there, but someone who's just trying to film and essentially take Homer and make it 2.5 hours long
Doesn't
and not a
work.
poem, it's never going to be as good.
I completely agree. So I've got a final question for you. Of all of the characters in the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, these three amazing, great works of human literature filled with massive characters, who would you say is the one that you are most that you most identify with? Who's your hero?
Well, that's a slightly different question twist at the end, because I might worry that I'm like Aeneas, duty and all that good stuff, but you want to be Achilles, That's a hard question. There are lots of sympathetic characters. I'm going to say Odysseus, not arrogantly, but only because I think he is the character that we come to know the best, and has that complexity of trying to do the right thing, not always able to do the right thing. He is simply the most complexly sketched character because, as we've said before, the whole focus of the Odyssey is on him, as is the case in the Aeneid. But I think Aeneas is a less interesting character. Whether, if any of the other characters and the heroes in the Iliad, had their own 24 books, I would have gone to Odysseus. I don't know, but Odysseus is the first. It really is the first sort of piece of
Modern
literature
man,
we have, which is a story about a single person examined psychologically as a character. And what about yourself?
Well, I'm really pleased you said that, because I was going to say I think that Odysseus is the one that reminds me most of you. Don't want to big you up too much here, but he's a complex character. I think, and I find him. I agree with you. He is the most interesting of the characters. I've always personally identified with Hector, this sort of doomed romantic figure, but unfortunately I increasingly come to recognise that I'm actually the guy who Odysseus meets in the underworld, who just was a minor character who drunkenly got so drunk that he fell asleep on a roof and then fell off the roof, and that was the end of him. Excellent. Exactly. Well, there you go. You see, you do the thinking and I'll do the drinking.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Cheers. It's a wrap.
Not a problem.
An epic podcast about epic poetry.
Your parents were too thick.
No, busy.
Teachers were too thick. Parents were too busy.
Other way around.
Your parents were too busy. Your teachers were too thick. You're just ignorant.
We'll get better at this, don't worry.
Yeah. It's terrible with scripting stuff. That's the thing.
You are notably bad. Were you never in a, like a panto or something when you were a kid? I mean, a school play?
Absolutely not.
And particularly given how good you are at chat, it seems extraordinary to me that your
I think actually
your whole life is an act, and yet you can't act. It's very odd.